Something doesn't add up here, and it's been bugging me for weeks. How did Native American tribes survive in places where even modern technology fails? In this video, I'm sharing the unbelievable truth about these ancient survival masters that will blow your mind. What you're about to discover will literally change how you see human potential forever. This journey into their secret world starts now. But before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more mind-blowing history, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. In the hush before dawn, where mist drapes the trees like a memory refusing to fade, the forests of eastern Connecticut breathe the breath of the ancestors. This is not the wild as we know it, not a place waiting to be conquered, charted, or fenced. It is a living cathedral of oak, maple, and white pine, and it remembers. Before the names were changed, before lines were drawn on maps by hands that did not belong to the land, this forest whispered in the language of the Eastern Pequot. A people born of the land, shaped by its seasons, fed by its rivers, and buried in its roots. They did not own the earth beneath their feet, they belonged to it. Every ridge, every stone, every bend in the river held a name, a story, a purpose. This was not wilderness, it was home. By the time the first Europeans set foot in this region, the Pequot Confederacy had already flourished for centuries. The Eastern Pequot, a distinct band within this powerful nation, made their lives along the coastal lowlands and rolling woodlands, where salt met soil and marsh gave way to dense forest. Their homes, known as wigwams, were not crude huts, but finely constructed shelters of bent saplings and birch bark. Built with intention, insulated with grass and hides, and oriented to shelter from the prevailing winds, they were warm in the depths of winter and cool in the punishing summers. Inside, flickers of firelight danced across bundles of corn, woven mats, and stone tools passed down for generations. Tools made not for waste, but for survival. Their tools told their story. A fishing spear carved from ash, honed and hardened by fire, waited by the riverbank each spring when the shad would return. A stone adze, smooth with years of use, helped fell saplings for the next generation's homes. A flint blade, sharper than steel, passed from hand to hand as hides were stretched, meat cured, and sinew bound into cordage. In the forests, they were masters. Their bushcraft was not a hobby, it was life. They could weave a snare blindfolded, read animal tracks like a written record, make fire with no flint, only bow, spindle, and memory. They knew the trees, not just by sight, but by feel, by scent, by what medicine or poison each one carried in its bark. To walk with them in those woods would be to see the world anew, not as a tangle of leaves, but as a map, a pharmacy, a kitchen, a church. The forest provided, but it also tested. And the Eastern Pequot met every season with reverence, readiness, and resilience. They followed the cycle of the land, moving with the seasons. Winter brought the people inland, where pine stands offered shelter from the worst winds. Spring called them back to the rivers to net alewife and shad. Summer meant planting and tending the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, in clearings opened by controlled fire, never with axes. And autumn, perhaps the most sacred time, was for harvest, for feasting, and for memory. Language was not written, but it was no less precise. The Pequot tongue carried centuries of knowledge. A word for snow that told you not just that it was falling, but whether it was heavy, dry, or ready to melt. A word for fire that spoke not just of flame, but of warmth, safety, ritual. These were not just descriptions. They were tools, as vital as any blade. At night, the fire in the wigwam would glow low, and stories would unfold in the flickering shadows. Tales of fox and crow, of the great turtle and the sky woman, of wars fought, lands claimed, and spirits that still moved among the trees. These were not myths. They were maps of the soul. Each child who listened was inheriting more than words. They were inheriting duty. Their relationship with the land was never passive. They shaped it, and it shaped them in return. Fire was not feared but harnessed. Controlled burns kept underbrush low and invited game animals. Trees were pruned for better acorn yields. Clay was dug, not to strip the earth, but to mould the vessels that would carry water and stew alike. They buried their dead not far from their homes, believing the spirits stayed near. A stone circle, a carving on bark, a feather tied to a branch, small marks in the forest that said, "We remember." But memory is fragile. And in the centuries that followed, the forest changed, not just in trees felled and rivers dammed, but in silence forced on its people. Yet if you listen closely, the old forest still whispers. It speaks of hands that knew how to harvest without taking, feet that moved silently through snow, voices that once filled the glades with song. And it remembers names that were nearly lost: Usamequin, Saunksqua, Metaquason, leaders, healers, hunters, and mothers. It remembers the hands that built the wigwams, that carved the canoe, that taught the child how to track deer, how to thank the earth, how to live not above nature, but within it. In the moss-covered stone and the rustle of wind through birch, you can still hear them. The eastern Pequot were never erased, only ignored. This story does not begin with tragedy. It begins with mastery, with the skill of a people whose knowledge of survival was passed not by books, but by firelight. Who could make shelter before the first snow, medicine from a crushed root, a feast from what the sea surrendered. They were not primitive, they were precise, and their story is still rooted in the soil of Connecticut, not as a memory, but as a living truth. The forest remembers, and now so do we. Long before the treaties, before the ink dried on documents never meant to be honored, the eastern Pequot lived by rhythms older than any map. The land was not divided, not yet. It breathed freely. Rivers followed their natural curves. The soil was unclaimed by fence or deed, and the people moved with the pulse of the seasons, not against them. Each migration was purposeful, from coastal bays where clams could be dug by hand to upland forests where deer tread softly through fallen leaves. They followed the stars, the tide, the wind. They needed no compass. The stories passed down through time were enough. In spring, they turned to the shore. The scent of salt in the air signaled the return of life. Generations gathered with woven baskets and sharpened sticks, digging into the tidal flats where the clams buried themselves. It was not just sustenance, it was tradition. The act itself was spiritual. Hands in mud, bodies bent low, breathing in rhythm with the earth. Elders say the clam beds sang when harvested with respect. That if you listened closely, you could hear the tide answer the songs of the gatherers. The catch was boiled in stone-lined pits. Steam rose with the morning mist, mingling with the laughter of children and the chants of mothers. Shells were saved, cleaned, and later carved into something sacred. Wampum. Not mere decoration, but currency, language, promise. The Pequot carved wampum from the quahog shell's deep purple heart. Each bead held weight beyond its size. Strings of wampum sealed marriages, settled disputes, and honored the dead. The color, the shape, the way it was strung, all told stories that could not be forgotten. Only the careful hands of trained artisans could carve these beads without cracking them. They used stone drills, spun by hand with sinew, until the shell gave way. In the glow of firelight, the beads would catch and scatter light, shimmering like stars caught in string. Nearby, the forest provided more than wood. It was a living armory, pharmacy, and guide. The men learned to read every rustle in the underbrush. A broken twig, a crushed patch of grass, signs as clear as ink. They tracked deer with quiet reverence. When the animal was taken, it was honored with a prayer, and none of it was wasted. The hide became clothing or shelter, the sinew, thread, the bones, tools, the stomach, a pouch. They hunted with bows carved from hickory and strung with animal gut. arrowheads chipped from quartz or flint, sometimes traded from as far away as the Hudson River Valley. Their tools carried fingerprints from miles, even centuries, away. This was not a world of isolation, but of vast connection. The Pequot traded widely, their networks reaching across tribal boundaries. Tobacco, copper, flint, corn, salt. Each item passed hand to hand, tribe to tribe, story to story. In the center of the village stood a fire that never truly died, kept alive by the women, tended through snowstorms and thunder. Their role was not secondary, it was sovereign. They were the landholders, the food growers, the keepers of lineage. Kinship was not just blood, it was responsibility. Matrilineal lines shaped inheritance, marriage, and leadership. A child's identity flowed through the mother's name. The women held the roots of the tribe. Each morning began with a ritual of thanks, not in churches, but beneath the sky. Smoke lifted from bundles of sweetgrass and sage. It drifted through the trees, calling to the spirits that watched. Spiritual life was not confined to temples or idols. It was everywhere. In the wind, the water, the fire, the forest. The creator, known as Cayetan, was not distant. He was present in the rhythm of life and the harmony of nature. Ceremonies marked every transition. The naming of a child, the first hunt, the changing of the moon. In these rituals, they danced not just for celebration, but for survival. Every drumbeat was a heartbeat, every footstep a promise to the ancestors. This was a society of laws, unwritten but understood. Justice was restorative, not punitive. A theft might require reparation, not imprisonment. A wrong could be set right through dialogue, mediation, and wampum. Elders were not pushed aside. They were the libraries of the tribe, walking archives of language, migration, treaty, and warning. Around the fire, their words shaped the future. The Eastern Pequot did not need paper to govern themselves. They had memory, they had ceremony, they had clarity, and they had balance. Balance between man and earth, balance between male and female, balance between past and future. Yet this balance was delicate, and somewhere beyond the ocean, it had already begun to tilt. Unseen ships were carving through Atlantic waves, their sails stretched like wings of conquest. They carried no understanding of this balance, only appetite, only ambition. But here, in this chapter of the world's story, the Eastern Pequot stood untouched, unbowed, unbroken. They were not waiting for rescue. They were not lost in time. They were builders of homes, not hovels, weavers of law, not chaos, guardians of knowledge too deep for written scrolls, and above all, survivors. When the first Europeans stepped ashore, they did not find a people in need. They found a civilization grounded in resilience. What followed would not be a meeting of equals, but here, in the time before the broken treaties. The Eastern Pequot stood tall, rooted, wise, and ready. The smoke came first, rising above the trees in slow curling tendrils, silent, steady, and wrong. Not the smoke of cooking fires or signal pines. This was the smoke of villages burning, and in that smoke, the world of the Pequot began to collapse. By the early 1630s, the Eastern Pequot stood at a crossroads they never asked for. The land that had always sustained them was shrinking, not by drought, not by winter, but by men in armor, carrying muskets and Bibles in equal weight. What began as trading, cautious, measured, quickly shifted into suspicion, and then into violence. The spark came in 1636. An English trader, John Oldham, was found dead off Block Island. The Puritan colonists of Massachusetts Bay blamed the Pequot, though the truth was far murkier. That didn't matter. Retribution had already been set in motion. English soldiers, armed with steel and supported by rival tribes, most notably the Mohegan and Narragansett, launched an expedition into Pequot territory. What followed was not a battle. It was a campaign, a systematic effort to remove a people from the land they called home. The forest, once their sanctuary, became a trap. In May of 1637, the war reached its horrifying crescendo in a fortified Pequot village along the Mystic River. Before dawn, over 500 men, women, and children lay sleeping inside the palisade. They had no warning. Captain John Mason, leading English forces, surrounded the village. He ordered the gates blocked and the homes set ablaze. The flames leapt skyward, consuming bark and beam, flesh and bone. As the Pequot ran, they were cut down by musket or sword. Later, Mason would write, "It was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." But there was no marvel, only massacre. It is said the cries echoed across the water for hours. The fire burned through the morning, and when the ashes cooled, the ground was soaked in more than just dew. Over 400 were killed that day, most of them women and children. What was once the heart of a proud nation now smouldered beneath a grey sky. And still, it was not over. In the months that followed, the surviving Pequot, scattered and hunted, were sold into slavery in the West Indies or forced to live among tribes that had allied with the colonists. A people who once moved freely now lived in the shadows of the very forests they once ruled. The Eastern Pequot, a smaller band within the greater Pequot nation, escaped total annihilation, but barely. They did not regroup in a single place. Instead, they splintered. Some hid deep in the swamps of Connecticut, living in hollowed-out shelters beneath the ground. Others fled to sympathetic bands of the Mohegan or Narragansett, where they survived quietly, sometimes under different names. Their language, once heard across the rivers, was now spoken only in whispers, passed to children in the spaces between fear and sleep. They could no longer live as they once had. Fires had to be small and smokeless, homes hidden, ceremonies quiet or disguised. Wigwams gave way to dugouts. Traditional dress was hidden under cast-off colonial rags. Sacred wampum was buried under hearthstones or sewn into clothing to escape detection. Still, they endured. There are stories, quiet, often unrecorded, of families living deep in the backwoods, planting the Three Sisters by moonlight, preserving tobacco seeds in bone tubes, and shaping fish hooks from antler when iron became too dangerous to carry. One Eastern Pequot elder, known only as Nanuet, is said to have kept a small bundle wrapped in deer hide beneath the roots of an old maple. Inside, a carved pipe, a few strands of wampum, and a flint blade from his grandfather. These were not just tools. They were memory. Even among allies, they were treated as shadows of a former people. The Narragansett and Mohegan had allied with the English, partly out of old rivalries, partly from fear. But after the war, the alliances frayed, trust evaporated, no one truly won. By the 1640s, the Eastern Pequot were no longer recognized as a sovereign power. The English labeled them as remnants, leftovers of a war they thought they had finished. But war does not end in the signing of a treaty or the drawing of a boundary. For those who survive, war lives on in every footprint left behind in the wrong place, in every meal cooked without fire, in every name that must be swallowed instead of spoken aloud. There was no reservation yet, no legal homeland, just fragments of a once mighty nation hiding behind the trees. And yet, they held on. They held on through bloodline and memory, through secret gatherings at night, where elders retold the origin stories in low voices, lest someone overhear, through stone pestles kept hidden behind false walls, and feathers sewn into the seams of winter cloaks. In these fragments, they found resistance. They did not rebuild what had been destroyed. They became something new. Wounded, yes. Dispersed, yes, but not gone. One colonial official, writing in 1652, remarked bitterly, "The Pequot do not vanish. They scatter like smoke, and still they breathe." It was meant as a curse. It became a prophecy. In time, the eastern Pequot would re-emerge, quietly, slowly, under names the English recognized, on lands barely acknowledged. But they would come, they would return. Because survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is a whisper. Sometimes it is fire, banked beneath ash, waiting. The war burned through everything it touched, villages, alliances, dreams. But the eastern Pequot, they were not finished. They were only hidden. The fires no longer lit the horizon. They smouldered now, low, careful, hidden deep beneath the forest floor. After the Pequot War, the land did not go silent, but the people were forced to. Those who survived, those who did not burn at Mystic, who were not sold to the West Indies, who were not marched under musket barrel to the edges of Erasure, they vanished into the woods. Not gone, just out of sight. In the shadowed corners of Connecticut, where the oak trees still stood thick and the rivers still spoke in their winding tongues, the ancestors of the eastern Pequot learned to live a different kind of life. A life of exile, not across an ocean or a distant plain, but in their own homeland. To survive now required more than skill. It demanded silence. The unmarked villages that rose in those years did not appear on any map. There were no fences, no plumes of chimney smoke to give them away. Homes were dug half into the earth, roofed with pine boughs, insulated with moss, and camouflaged with bark. From a distance, they looked like mounds, nothing more. But within them flickered life. There was no council fire, not as before. No great gatherings where stories were told aloud and drums answered the wind. But in the dark, in whispers, the stories still lived. Passed from mother to daughter, from elder to boy, one breath at a time. They called it talking under the skin, language pressed low, just under the ribs, where no outsider could hear. Even tools had to change. The stone and bone that once served them well were now traded in secret for scraps of iron scavenged from colonial dumps. A broken horseshoe became a knife. A rusted hinge, reshaped by stone and sweat, turned into a workable axe head. These were not the weapons of warriors anymore. These were tools of quiet survival. Everything was done with care, not just to succeed, but to remain unseen. Fires were lit using dry cedar and birch shavings, tended with a fan of woven bark to keep smoke thin and low. Fish were caught with traps crafted from woven vines, no splashing, no nets that might be spotted from the waterway. Even gardens were hidden. Corn was planted in sunlit clearings surrounded by dense underbrush, their rows masked by shrubs and wildflowers. Beans climbed up branches trained to curve naturally. Squash nestled low in the shade. From above, it looked like a patch of forest, not a field. And yet, they thrived. Not in numbers, not in comfort, but in will. They survived through a code of silence that ran deeper than any law. To speak the old language in front of the wrong settler could mean expulsion or death. So they passed it down through games, through coded lullabies sung while grinding corn, through hand signs and rhythm. One Pequot woman, known only as Wayapan, taught her children the names of herbs while braiding their hair. Each braid, a plant, each twist, a use. This one, she'd say softly, brings down fever. A tug on the end. This one can stop a bleeding wound. It was how she remembered. How they remembered. Hunting became more dangerous. The crack of a musket was a risk. So they returned to the bow. Not the proud war bows of their ancestors, but short-hunted curves fashioned from ash and strung with gut. Silent. Lethal. Forgotten. They could not carry these openly, so they carved them to resemble walking sticks. Arrows were tucked in bundles of firewood, a hawk feather tied near the notch, a signal to those who knew. This one still remembers. Ceremony too was forced to change. No great fires, no dancing circles. Instead, a single feather placed in a tree before the first hunt, a circle drawn in ash around the cooking pot. a deer bone carved with 7 notches, buried under the roots of a maple. Symbols, signs, reminders. The creator, Keaton, was still with them, but now his name was spoken in silence, marked only by a hand over the heart when the wind moved in a certain way. In those years, between the 1640s and early 1700s, generations were born and buried beneath the canopy. Children who never knew what it meant to speak their name freely. Elders who refused to forget, even as their bones ached with hunger and frost. And the settlers, for the most part, believed the Pequot gone. The war had ended, the treaties signed, the land redivided. But you cannot divide what still breathes. Beneath the roots, beneath the soil, beneath the eye of the colonist, the Pequot endured. One English trader named Thomas Ridley once wrote in a journal, "There are those who dwell in the woods, like ghosts. I've seen their tracks. I've heard their drums at night, low and slow, like heartbeats through the trees." He was not wrong. Those who remained were not rebuilding a nation. They were keeping it alive until the world might see it again. Each winter that did not kill them. Each spring that brought wild onions and trout. Each summer where the sun warmed hidden fields. It all mattered, because survival now was the rebellion. To remain on the land they had bled for. To raise children who still knew the stories. To sing to the wind, even if softly. That was power. One story survives from a winter in the late 1600s. A young boy, a Seaton, wandered too close to a settler's farm and was caught. Cold, afraid, and barefoot. The farmer asked him who he was, what he was doing. The boy looked up and simply said, "I'm gathering kindling." But in his hand, clenched tightly, was a wampum bead, purple, polished, and smooth, passed to him by his grandfather. A piece of history that could not be bartered, could not be broken. He was not gathering kindling, he was gathering memory. These are not the stories found in history books, but they are real as the stone pestles buried in old clearings, as real as the birch bark still used to line hidden shelters, as real as the fire, still burning, low and steady, beneath the snow. The eastern Pequot did not survive because they were left alone. They survived because they never stopped listening to the land, to each other, to the old voices, even when they could only be heard in dreams. And so, in the hidden spaces between conquest and forgetting, they endured. The forest kept their secrets, and the flame, though hidden, never went out. There are places on the map where borders are drawn in ink, and there are places where they are drawn in blood. In the year 1683, the colony of Connecticut did something both bold and bitter. They took a sliver of land, 280 acres nestled in what is now North Stonington, and declared it a reservation for the eastern Pequot. It was not a gift, it was a containment, a boundary line etched not to protect, but to define limits, on movement, on memory, on freedom. But to the eastern Pequot, it was also something else. It was place, a foothold, a narrow breath of homeland that could not be erased entirely. They took it, and they made it theirs. The trees that ringed the reservation bore the marks of old axes, Pequot made, passed down, honed on river stones. Small fields were cleared by hand, not plough, and turned with tools fashioned from scrap iron and native ingenuity. The land wasn't rich, but it grew enough. Beans, corn, squash, and sometimes just enough tobacco for ceremony. They built homes not of nostalgia, but of need. Some were log cabins with clay chimneys and plank roofs, hammered together with salvaged nails. Others, still, were bark-covered wigwams, reminders of the old ways, built quietly in the shadows where colonists wouldn't see. In spring, children gathered dandelion greens and wild leeks. In summer, they chased frogs in shallow creeks, their feet black with mud and joy. In fall, the scent of wood smoke mingled with that of drying corn braided and hung from rough-hewn rafters. And in winter, silence, but not defeat. Life on the reservation was not peace. It was pressure. Each year brought new restrictions, new rumors, new eyes watching from beyond the stone walls. The colonists referred to the Pequot as wards, not citizens, not equals. There was no vote, no protection, only permission. To hunt beyond the boundary, you needed a pass. To sell corn at market, approval. To build another house, denied unless the town council agreed. And yet, they stayed. They stayed because this land, even in its narrowness, still held their dead, still knew their names, still bore the footprints of ancestors who once walked freely before the treaties, before the muskets, before the fire. Inside the bounds of that reservation, a quiet resistance endured. They continued to hunt, not with muskets, but with bows passed from father to son. They walked trails known only to them, deep into the woods beyond the official lines, where deer still moved and memory still breathed. Fishing weirs, made from stone and willow, were tucked into rivers far from prying eyes. At night, elders taught children how to read the stars, not as sailors, but as survivors. A way to find your way home when the ground beneath you no longer feels like yours. The reservation became both cage and cradle, a place where the outside world pressed harder every year. But inside, they preserved what could not be taken. Language, names, ritual, rhythm. One document from the late 1700s, written by a colonial minister, noted with concern that the Indians maintained strange customs, yet whispering prayers to trees and refusing Christian burial. What he witnessed was not strange, it was sacred. Yes, Christianity had arrived, imposed by missionaries, encouraged by the government, baptized in pressure. Some Pequot converted, some blended the old ways with the new, but none forgot who they were. A woman named Tachi, born in 1765, kept a small pouch tied to her skirt. Inside, a piece of tobacco, a carved deer bone, and a scrap of cloth from her mother's dress. Every morning, she would step to the edge of the woods, breathe deeply, and speak the old words. Soft, steady, shaped by breath and memory. Those who saw her thought she was muttering, but she was praying. Farming was difficult. The land, overworked and rocky, gave only what it could. Families made what they could with what they had. Pots patched with pitch, clothes handed down until they unraveled. Meals stretched with wild berries, game, and hope. To survive, many intermarried with Narragansett, Mohegan, and even African-descended people who found themselves equally excluded from colonial society. Bloodlines blurred, names changed, but the identity remained. Eastern Pequot became more than a tribe. It became a thread, tied in defiance, pulled through centuries of erosion, still unbroken. Even as the government forgot them, even as their land was slowly, silently reduced, even as settlers built roads through their boundaries and churches over their graves, they stayed. In the 1800s, the reservation saw more pressure. White neighbors began encroaching on the land, grazing their cattle on Pequot fields, cutting down Pequot trees. Complaints were made, ignored, petitions filed, denied. Still, the people endured. They made baskets from ash splints and sold them at distant markets, walking miles to trade a week's work for a few coins. They carved wooden spoons and beadwork, careful to include symbols only another Pequot would recognize. They gathered for harvest dances, always small, always at dusk, when outsiders were less likely to watch. One elder, Samuel Beartrack, is said to have worn the same jacket every winter for 20 years. Inside the lining, stitched into the cloth, was a strip of deer hide marked with his clan sign, passed to him by his grandfather, who had lived through the war. That jacket, worn thin by time and toil, was more than warmth. It was armor. These are the details history forgets, the long winters of the forgotten, the quiet decisions made at the edge of the firelight, the mothers who taught songs in languages they were told to abandon, the fathers who hunted beyond the boundary, not just for food, but for pride. The reservation at North Stonington was never meant to last, but it did, not because of policy, but because of people. People who knew that land is more than property. It is identity. It is proof. It is a heartbeat under your feet. And though that land grew smaller, poorer, and more contested over time, the Eastern Pequot made it matter. Through their hands, through their stories, through every seed planted, an arrow carved, and prayer whispered to the wind. The reservation was never just a line on a map. It was, and is, the place where the fire stayed lit. Low, quiet, but burning still. There are places marked on maps with ink, but some places are carved into memory, into breath, into footsteps, into the marrow of the land itself. In 1683, after decades of violence, betrayal, and near erasure, the colony of Connecticut took a sliver of land, 280 acres, and designated it as a reservation for what they called the remnants of the Pequot. They did not call it justice. They did not call it mercy. It was a boundary, a box, a place to contain a people the colony could not fully destroy, but no longer wished to see. Yet for the Eastern Pequot, that fractured stretch of forest in what would become North Stonington, it was something else entirely. It was the only ground left that still whispered their names. The land was rocky, the soil stubborn, but it was theirs. And so they stayed. They cleared it with iron blades forged from colonial scrap, hammered flat over stone anvils, and passed hand to hand. They planted with fingers hardened by cold. Corn, beans, squash, tobacco in small sacred rows. They fished the nearby streams using willow traps passed down through generations, shaped by memory, not books. Homes rose where none had stood for years. Some were square cabins with chinked logs and thatch. Others, bark-covered wigwams, half buried into the slope of a hill for warmth. You could walk past them and not even know they were there. That was by design, because the Pequot knew, even on land they were given, they were not safe. At any moment, a settler's cart could roll through the boundary. Cattle might graze on their corn. Timber might be cut from their trees. If they protested, they were ignored. If they resisted, they were punished. And yet, the Eastern Pequot did not vanish. They lived with grit and silence, a survival honed not through confrontation, but through quiet mastery of the land and of secrecy. They still hunted, not with muskets, those made noise, drew attention, but with bows carved from ash and strung with sinew, arrows tipped with flint or hammered iron, hidden in bundles of kindling or tied beneath coats. One boy, Humes, was taught to walk the woods without leaving a footprint. His grandfather showed him how to step where the deer stepped, how to listen for wind direction, how to vanish behind the motionless bark of an oak. The land watches you, he was told, so learn to walk like you belong. On cold nights, stories were whispered in the dark, not just of the war, but of the stars, the rivers, the medicine plants that still grew near the edges of stone walls. They spoke the language, Pequot Mohegan, only when they knew no settler was near. Even their ceremonies evolved. There were no great dances, no fire-circled drums echoing through the hills, but a feather placed high in a pine tree at sunrise was still a prayer. A shell buried at the crossroads of a deer trail, still a song. One woman, Mahush, kept a bundle beneath her floorboards, a turtle shell, red paint, an eagle claw, and a string of old wampum. She never let her children see it until they were old, enough to understand what it meant. Not all prayers are for others to hear, she said. Religion arrived too, forced Christianity. Some Pequot adopted it, worn like a borrowed coat. Others folded its words into their own beliefs, speaking of Christ and Keaton in the same breath, beneath the same sky. A few rejected it entirely, but never openly. A Christian minister in the late 1700s complained in his journal, "They speak English when asked, but amongst themselves revert to a tongue I do not understand. Their children are baptized, but I sense they hold to older ways. Their women offer thanks to the moon and speak to the trees. I suspect heathenism beneath civility. He was right, and the Pequot made no apology. The reservation was pressure, but within that pressure, they preserved what mattered. They crafted baskets from ash splints and swamp maple. Each weave had a pattern, a rhythm, passed down by mothers and grandmothers. The baskets were sold to colonial towns for coins that barely bought flour. But every sale was also a statement. We're still here. Boys worked as farmhands for pennies. Girls stitched clothes for white families in nearby towns. But at night, when the chores were done, they returned to the firelight, where elders told the truth, not the one in books, but the one carved in scars. The lines between tribes blurred. Mohegan, Narragansett, African, even some runaway indentured Europeans intermarried into the community. A new kind of survival was forming, built from mixture, not purity. And still, the core remained Pequot. In the stories, in the medicine bundles, in the quiet defiance. They resisted not through violence, but through continuity. Each planting of corn, each deer hunted in secret, each name whispered in the mother tongue, and they resisted through record. In 1795, a Pequot man named Joseph Simons submitted a petition to the Connecticut General Assembly asking for protection of reservation land from encroachment. His handwriting was clumsy, his spelling uneven, but the message was clear. We ask only what is ours, to live upon what we are given, and to be left in peace as we were before your fathers came. It was denied, but he wrote it anyway, and in doing so, he ensured they would not be forgotten. Even as the 1800s arrived, and steam replaced the river, and factories replaced the forest, the eastern Pequot endured. Some left, seeking wages in the whaling towns of New London, or as sailors on merchant ships. Others remained, holding the land like a final breath in a drowning world. By 1850, less than a few dozen lived full-time on the reservation, but their presence was undeniable. They were not ghosts, they were roots that no sawmill, no courtroom, no census could remove. Because land is not only a place, it is a memory, and memory, once buried, can still grow back. So the reservation that time tried to forget was never truly forgotten. Not by the trees, not by the wind, and certainly not by the people who still walk its trails, quietly, proudly, defiantly. The fire may have been banked low, but it never went out. In the windswept hollows of North Stonington, history is not just buried beneath the soil, it's braided into the blood, and that blood, the lifeblood of the Eastern Pequot, does not run pure by colonial standards. It never did, because survival never asked permission to be simple. This is the chapter history books often skip, the one that doesn't fit neatly into categories, the one that makes officials uncomfortable and census takers hesitate. But it is real as the frost on the corn husk, as real as the fire that never went out. From the early 1700s through the 1800s, life on the Eastern Pequot Reservation was shaped not just by what had been lost, but by what had been woven in. African blood, native memory, a single fire shared. The Pequot had long endured erasure, but now, as laws hardened around race, another weapon was drawn against them: identity itself. Colonial officials began to sort people not by who they were, but by what they looked like. Skin color, hair texture, family names. The invisible lines of one-drop rules and blood quantum. Many Eastern Pequot had African ancestry, born of bonds between exiled peoples, runaway slaves, freedmen, sailors from whaling ports, laborers from the edge of the empire. They came with nothing, except hands ready to work, wounds they did not speak of, and dreams the world said they couldn't have. And in the forest, among the Pequot, they found something rare: recognition. Not in the language of courts, but in the rhythm of daily life. A man with African roots and a native heart could plant beans in the same field, could carve a spoon, mend a net, learn the old ways whispered at dusk. He could marry into the bloodline, raise children who knew how to hunt with bow and memory. But outside those woods, the world grew sharper. Colonial records began labeling these people colored, mulatto, Negro, and later, not Indian. Not Indian. As if culture could be reduced to pigment, as if ceremony could be undone by the shape of a cheekbone. One Pequot woman, born in 1829, was denied recognition by a town clerk who wrote simply, "She is too dark to be of Indian stock." But what that clerk didn't see was the shell rattle she kept by her bed, the tobacco she planted every spring, the stories she told her daughters about the fire at Mystic, and the way her great-grandmother buried a carved turtle under a pine to keep the old name safe. These were not forgotten people. They were outsiders within, both central to the tribe's survival, and yet increasingly erased by the documents that claimed to define them. The state began denying Pequot petitions on the grounds that the tribe no longer existed. Why? Because the faces didn't fit their mold. Too much African, too little recognition. It was a slow war, not with guns, but with paper, with bureaucrats who filed identity into folders, with laws that said Indian was only who the state decided it was. And yet, in the woods at night, around low fires, the Pequot knew better. They remembered who had tended the graves, who had carried the names, who had spoken the language when it was dangerous to do so. Many of those were men and women with skin the state called black, but the blood remembered. So did the land. These mixed families became keepers of memory. They taught their children to fish with bare hands, to use moss to dress wounds, to mark the seasons by the shifting of birds and the flowering of wild mint. They passed down songs with verses so old no one remembered the full meaning, only the feeling. Grief braided with pride, loss folded into resilience. They built homes from what the world left behind, scavenged wood, broken stone, the thrown-away tools of a world that did not see their worth. But inside those homes were bundles of herbs, wampum sewn into quilt linings, bows resting above door frames. In the absence of external validation, they became their own archive. One man, Elijah Simons, born in 1852, kept a journal where he recorded every birth, death, and naming ceremony within the Eastern Pequot community. Not because anyone asked him to, but because no one else would. And when the state later tried to argue the tribe had vanished, Elijah's journal stood as proof. Proof written not in code, but in names. Names that still walk the land today. For decades, mixed-race Eastern Pequot were denied full tribal status. They were left off rolls, excluded from court petitions, told they were descendants, but not true members. But what the courts couldn't erase was community. They still showed up for funerals, still planted at the old fields, still prayed facing the morning sun, still gathered for naming rights in the pine grove that settlers had forgotten existed. And over time, the truth sharpened, not in bitterness, but in quiet clarity. That identity is not granted by governments, it is lived. In the calloused hands that shape the basket, in the stew that still simmers with corn and smoked deer meat, in the stories of the fire that once burned at Mystic, and the people who made sure it never died. And so, the Eastern Pequot carried on, not as a museum piece, not as a pure bloodline, but as a living people, shaped by survival, resilience, and love. The kind of love that stretches across boundaries, across skin, across law. This is not a story of erasure, it is a story of refusal. The refusal to be categorized, the refusal to be disappeared, the refusal to forget, because the fire never asked who lit it, only that it burned. There are moments in history not marked by battles, not recorded in treaties, not preserved in ink or lore. But you can feel them. They're the weight between generations, the silence between stories, the space between names forgotten and names remembered only in whispers. For the Eastern Pequot, that space lasted nearly 100 years, a silent century. From the late 1800s into the middle of the 20th century, they seemed to vanish. Not because they were gone, but because the world stopped looking and stopped listening. Census records forgot them. Land agents stopped visiting. Newspapers no longer spoke their name. To the outside world, they were ghosts. To the state, they were a closed file. To the machinery of history, they had been erased. But inside the reservation boundaries, beneath the thinning canopy of trees and behind weather-worn doors, the story continued. It just wasn't being told. It was a time of pressure, subtle and relentless. A time when being too Indian brought risk, of ridicule, of exclusion, of punishment. So people learned to walk quiet, to speak soft, to remember, without being seen, remembering. The Pequot language, once carried on the wind and into the rivers, began to fade. Mothers taught it less and less. Children were told, "Speak English when you go to town. Don't give them reason." There were no schools teaching Pequot history, no museums displaying their tools, no textbooks telling their truth. In fact, many Pequot children were sent to public schools that denied their identity altogether. Some were listed as Negro, others as mixed, and still others as unknown. And when they asked, "Who am I supposed to be?" the world answered, "Not what you think." So they learned to split their tongues. One voice for home, one for outside, one truth for the family fire, another for the teacher's desk. Even the clothing changed. Moccasins gave way to worn leather boots. Wampum belts were packed into trunks and forgotten beneath floorboards. Ceremonial beads, once worn with pride, became keepsakes hidden in dresser drawers. But some women still sewed fringe into hems and stitched symbols into shawls that only other Pequot could read. One grandmother, Emma Beartrack, embroidered a turtle onto the lining of every grandchild's winter coat. Not for fashion, for memory. You'd never know it was there unless you knew to look. And that was the secret of survival during the silent century. To remember, without letting the world know you remembered. Farms dwindled. Jobs were scarce. Men took labor where they could, clearing timber, hauling fish, working docks and factories. Women grew what they could in backyard plots, but those gardens were more than food. They were ancestral. Corn was still planted in mounds. Beans wrapped up the stalks. Squash spread like memory across the ground. Wild mint and sweetgrass grew at the edges, gathered for teas and offerings. No one wrote it down. No one called it a tradition. It was just how things were done. In the evenings, elders sang songs under their breath. Not loudly, not like before. Just enough for the children to hear and wonder. The drums were gone, but the rhythm remained in the way the fire was stirred, in the tap of a hand against a knee, in the way stories moved. Not forward, but in circles. One child, Raymond Little Turtle Simons, remembered how his grandfather would sit on the porch in the last light of day carving. Not for sale, not for display, just carving. Stone blades, bone needles, ashwood bows. "Why do you make those, grandfather?" Raymond once asked. "Because someday you'll need to know how," he answered. "Because someday they'll ask who we were, and you'll show them what we did." There were no tribal councils, no annual reports, no meetings with the government. But still, they gathered. In kitchens, on porches, at funerals, where the old prayers still found their way into the dirt. At weddings, where wild sage was burned behind closed doors. At births, where names were chosen not from the Bible, but from the river. The silence wasn't always chosen. It was survival. Because during those years, from 1880 to 1950, there were many who wanted the final story written. State officials whispered about reclaiming the land. Historians dismissed them as extinct. Anthropologists came looking for authentic Indians and turned away when they didn't see feathers and paint. One government report from 1911 read, "There are people claiming Pequot descent, but they have long since ceased to be culturally Indian. But how do you measure culture? In feathers? Or in the way a seed is passed from hand to hand, season to season? In headpieces? Or in stories whispered before bed, about the fire that once swept through Mystic, and the bones buried in that soil? In paper? Or in blood?" The world refused to see them, but they were there, holding on, shaping memory with calloused hands and quiet eyes. Even as the 20th century marched forward, with radios, Model Ts, then television, the Eastern Pequot remained, fewer in number, less visible, but still here. And when outsiders asked, "Where did the Pequot go?" the answer was simple. They never left. They just learned how to live within the silence. And when the time came to speak again, to stand, to file for recognition, to bring the truth back into the light, it was not born from nowhere. It was born from this, from the seeds planted in back gardens, from the carvings hidden under beds, from the shawls passed down and the words still whispered in the dark. This chapter has no famous names, no wars, no headlines, only memory, and the people who refuse to forget. Narrator voice, deep, cinematic, rising with quiet intensity. The forest had been quiet for too long. For nearly a century, the Eastern Pequot had survived by lowering their voices, by hiding their stories behind garden fences and attic boxes, by whispering memories rather than declaring them. But the silence had begun to wear thin. By the early 1970s, something shifted. A new generation was coming of age, born under the weight of erasure, but unwilling to inherit invisibility. They had heard the stories, they had seen the land, and they were ready to speak. It started not in courtrooms, but in kitchens, in elders' homes with sagging porches and crooked floorboards. Old women opened cedar chests and unwrapped bundles long kept hidden, birth records stained with oil, handwritten letters from state agents, baptismal certificates listing Pequot in faded script. Men traced family lines on yellowing paper, building trees out of memory and instinct, names whispered by grandmothers, names not found in any official archive. Each paper, each name, each story, a brick in the wall of truth. But truth alone was not enough. To the federal government, being Indian, truly Indian, had become something measurable, not in soul, but in paperwork. Continuous tribal existence, political influence or authority, descent from a historical tribe. These were the words on the forms, cold, bureaucratic, final. And for the Eastern Pequot, whose ancestors had survived war, exile, and a century of silence, these were the new enemies, but they were ready. In 1979, the tribe officially began the process of seeking federal recognition, not as a favor, not as a symbol, but as a declaration of fact. We were never gone. The process would last decades. Petitions were filed, evidence was gathered, not just stories, but land deeds, tax receipts, voter rolls, family Bibles, court transcripts. Anything that proved that across time, the Pequot had not vanished. The government asked for maps. So tribal historians mapped every acre their families had lived on, planted on, prayed on, back to 1683, and before. The government asked for proof of governance. So elders explained the unbroken thread of family leadership, how the tribe had always known who spoke for them, even when the state forgot to ask. The government asked for evidence of cultural continuity, so they showed them baskets, tools, language patterns still used by elders, photos of ceremonies from the 1930s, quiet gatherings by the fire circle, captured in black and white, full of color no lens could see. But behind every document was a weight. Every form submitted was a wound reopened. Every court hearing was a reminder, you do not belong until we say you do. One elder, Ruth Barber, gave testimony in a hearing in 1983. She was in her 70s. Her voice was thin, but steady. When asked if she could prove she was Pequot, she answered, "I don't need to prove it to you. I've been burying my family here since before your state existed. That's my proof." There were tears. There was silence. But still, the process continued. Over 10,000 pages of evidence were compiled. Each page a fingerprint of survival. Each affidavit a shout pulled from the hush of generations. But the toll was enormous. Families fought over names. Old divisions resurfaced. Some feared the scrutiny, afraid that what they shared might be used against them, that their identity might be picked apart, reduced, invalidated. Because how do you measure what was lived in shadows? How do you define a culture that refused to be erased, not with banners and revolts, but by persisting, quietly, defiantly, stubbornly? And still, they pressed on. Children of those who once hid their identity were now driving to Washington, D.C., knocking on the doors of lawmakers, learning legal language like they once learned how to skin deer, out of necessity, out of survival. In 1990, a breakthrough. The Bureau of Indian Affairs acknowledged the Eastern Pequot Tribal Nations petition as ready for active consideration. It would take another decade before a decision would come. Years of review, counter-arguments, legal doubts, and behind every file was a person holding their breath. The weight of 5 centuries pressed against every sentence. And then, in 2002, the decision came. Federal recognition granted. After centuries of betrayal, after the fire at Mystic, after the reservation boundaries, after the silence and the hiding and the bureaucratic chokehold, the Eastern Pequot were once again, officially, undeniably, seen. There were cheers and tears, and the sound of drums that had not been heard in public for generations. But the celebration did not last. Just 2 years later, under political pressure and administrative reversal, the decision was rescinded. Federal recognition revoked, the first time in US history that had happened. The government called it a correction. The tribe called it what it was, erasure, again. But this time, they did not go silent, because the reawakening had already happened. It was too late to bury the truth. Too many had stood up, too many had spoken, too many had remembered. The Eastern Pequot remain, still on their land, still filing petitions, still fighting court battles, but more than that, still passing on the stories, still planting the corn, still naming their children in the old ways. This is not the end, this is the return. Because once a fire is lit, truly lit, you can bury it under snow, you can drown it in silence, you can pretend it's gone. But it waits, and when the time is right, it burns again. It was early summer in Connecticut. The trees were thick with green, the kind that smells like rain and memory. And in the quiet spaces of North Stonington, something stirred that hadn't stirred in generations. Not wind, not birdsong, but certainty. They had been seen. After centuries of silence, scars, and struggle, the Eastern Pequot tribe had, at long last, been federally recognized by the United States government. It was July 1st, 2002. But for the Eastern Pequot, it could have been 1638, or 1683, or 1934, because for them, time didn't move in straight lines. It circled, and on that day, the circle closed. Drums echoed again on the reservation land, not just for ceremony, but for triumph. The people came, dozens, then hundreds, from the trees, the coast, from cities they had been forced into generations ago. Some drove in from Boston and Providence. Some came from as far as California, Pequot by blood, pulled back by something older than distance. They wore ribbon shirts, moccasins, wampum necklaces, and eyes full of something that had long been held in check: joy. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was ancestral vindication. Because recognition didn't mean being granted existence. It meant the government had finally caught up to the truth. We were always here. There were elders who wept, not out of relief, but because they had outlived every voice that told them they didn't count. One woman, Beatrice White Oak Simons, had kept every denial letter the tribe had received since 1978 in a wooden box under her bed. On the day of recognition, she brought that box into the sun and burned every letter. Not out of spite, but to clear space for a new chapter. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had done what many thought impossible. They had reviewed over 20,000 documents, listened to testimony from more than 150 tribal members, studied genealogies, land records, and oral traditions. And after 2 decades, they had ruled. The Eastern Pequot tribal nation meets the criteria for federal acknowledgement. The words echoed across media outlets, courtrooms, and kitchen tables. But their truest echo was in the wind between the pines, where the old ones were said to still walk. On the reservation, a fire was lit. Not ceremonial, not symbolic, but real. A sacred fire for ancestors, for the fallen at Mystic, for those who were sold into bondage, hidden in swamps, labeled as colored, denied by schools, laughed at by lawyers, erased from maps. And as it burned, children danced, barefoot, laughing, their faces painted not for performance, but for memory. Wampum belts were brought out from safekeeping. Turtle shell rattles were shaken beside cedar drums. Women sang in old dialects that hadn't left their tongues in 60 years. And no one hushed them. A young boy named Isaiah Red Cedar Green, only 10 years old, stood beside the fire holding a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside were tobacco leaves, a photograph of his great-grandmother, and a chip of granite from the site of the Mystic Massacre. He stepped forward, slowly, and placed the bundle into the flames. Then he whispered, not loudly, but with conviction, "They know we made it." The words caught in the wind and seemed to settle on the shoulders of everyone present. Because in that moment, it was no longer just about status. It wasn't about benefits or recognition documents or court files. It was about returning to dignity, to presence, to truth. It was about the fact that for the first time in generations, the tribe could speak their name without fear of contradiction. Eastern Pequot, the people of the morning woods, the ones who remembered, the ones who endured, the ones who were not extinct. There was talk of building a cultural centre, a new language program, a school curriculum. Plans were drawn up for preserving old foodways, crafting classes, even land reclamation efforts. Hope moved like wildfire, not destructive, but illuminating. Elders began recounting old stories they had never dared share in public. Songs long forgotten resurfaced in the voices of grandchildren. One man began teaching a class on how to make fish traps using white oak and black ash, the way his grandfather taught him when no one else was watching. It wasn't just a tribal awakening. It was a generational ignition. And yet, even as the fire of recognition blazed, shadows lingered at the edge. There were whispers of appeals, of political resistance, of other tribes objecting, of towns and state officials raising concerns about casinos, taxes, land. But on that day, in that moment, those voices were distant. Because for the first time in 400 years, the descendants of a people nearly erased stood together, not as remnants, but as a nation, Eastern Pequot. And even if the world would again try to turn the page, even if bureaucrats would one day attempt to undo what had been acknowledged, this day was real. The drums beat, the children laughed, the stories flowed like river water through the trees, and above it all, through tears, smoke, song, and laughter, one truth rang louder than any denial. They were still here, and they always had been. The fire had barely cooled. The drums still echoed faintly in memory. The dust from that summer, the laughter, the songs, the sacred dances, still clung to the trees. But in 2005, the wind changed, and this time it didn't carry hope. It carried a letter, stamped, signed, sealed, delivered not with ceremony, but with finality. The United States government had made its decision. The Eastern Pequot's federal recognition, the one they had fought for over generations, was revoked. It was a word that struck like frost after fire, not challenged, not delayed, revoked, gone. The joy that had taken centuries to surface was swept away in one sentence, a reversal with no precedent, a dismantling not of paperwork, but of identity. 3 years, that's all they had. 3 years of being seen. 3 years of planning schools, gardens, and programs. 3 years of finally saying the word Pequot without flinching. And then, the silence returned. But colder this time. Not hiding, just stunned. Because what do you say to a government that tells you, we made a mistake? You were never who we said you were. It wasn't just a legal reversal. It was a gut punch to memory. Behind that decision lay a storm of politics. Local town officials feared land loss, feared casinos, feared change. Coalitions were formed, not against crime or injustice, but against acknowledgement. They lobbied, they sued, they wrote editorials, they whispered into the ears of senators, and when the Bureau of Indian Affairs reviewed the case again, under new pressure, new leadership, new fear, they yielded, citing insufficient evidence of continuous tribal existence. As if 300 years of survival, secrecy, and quiet resistance could be dismissed by a phrase. One tribal member, Elijah Morningtree, stood in front of a news camera that day. His voice didn't tremble, it cracked. They told us to prove we were alive. We did. And then they told us they got it wrong. How do you prove who you are to people who don't want you to exist? For the elders, it was betrayal wrapped in bureaucracy. Some had waited their entire lives for that 2002 moment. They had given interviews, donated heirlooms, told stories they never thought they'd say aloud. Now, they watched that truth unravel in real time, on TV, in courtrooms, in the cold legalese of a rescission letter. One elder, Martha Red Fern Green, stopped speaking publicly after the reversal. She had been the voice of the tribe for years, but after 2005, her friends said she rarely spoke at all, not out of shame, but grief. Because for Native communities across the country, this wasn't just about the Pequot. It was a signal that survival might not be enough, that proof might not be enough, that even history could be voted down. There were lawsuits, there were petitions, there were protests, but the recognition did not return. Tribal members gathered again, not for celebration, but for ceremony, not to ask permission, but to remember. A fire was lit again, this time under cloudy skies. No press, no officials, just the people. They sang the old songs. They passed around corn soup and venison. And when the fire burned low, one child, no more than 12, stood and said, "We don't need papers. We have each other." The adults didn't answer, but they nodded, because while the government had rescinded recognition, they couldn't rescind memory. They couldn't undo the ceremonies, the languages, the names whispered at births and burned into wood. They couldn't revoke the truth. The Eastern Pequot were not surprised, not really, because they had lived this story before, in 1638, in 1830, in 1934. Hope, then silence, then fire again. It was not new, it was just again. And in that way, the pain was deeper, but so was the resilience, because even as they mourned, they planned. Even as they wept, they organized. They filed new documentation, held workshops, reopened ancestral studies, created digital archives, raised funds to protect their reservation, taught young people the old crafts, how to make fish traps, carve cedar spoons, tend ash trees. Because recognition comes and goes. But survival, that is something passed hand to hand, not given, not taken. And even now, as the government files sit locked away, as politicians move on to other matters, as lobbyists turn their attention elsewhere, the Eastern Pequot remain, not waiting, not pleading, just being, in the soil, in the fires, in the language echoing through kitchen walls. You see, history may rise and fall in courtrooms, but the heart of a people is not built on rulings. It's built on songs, on names, on the stubborn act of staying. So even though the United States government chose to look away, the Pequot are still here, still planting, still telling stories, still walking the paths their ancestors walked. And if you ask them who they are, they'll answer, with no hesitation, no papers, no court orders. Simply, the fire crackles softly beneath a canopy of maples, their leaves whispering in the wind like elders in prayer. The smoke rises slow, curling toward the stars, carrying cedar, sweetgrass, and memory into the night. Around it, the circle is unbroken. There are no officials watching, no cameras, no declarations to be signed, just hands, weathered and young, shaping tradition in the dark. A boy is learning to make fire, not with matches, not with lighters, but with cedar bark, bow drill, and patience. Beside him, a woman, his aunt, hums a song that her mother's mother sang. No one ever wrote it down. It lives in breath, in memory, in blood. This is what remains, and what refuses to vanish. The Eastern Pequot never needed paper to know who they were, but the world tried to make them forget, tried to shrink them into census boxes, tried to bury them under legal definitions, tried to define them by absence, by what they had lost. But they are not the silence between court dates. They are the heartbeat before the ruling, after the ruling, beyond the ruling, because a people is not made by recognition. A people is made by continuity, by the simple, defiant act of continuing. And here, in the forests of eastern Connecticut, the Eastern Pequot continue. They continue to speak, not fluently, not always confidently, but with intent. Children learn the old words now, one at a time, not in schools, but in kitchens. A grandmother points to a deer and says, "Mausch." A grandson repeats, giggles, and says it again. Language like sap, slow, sweet, sticky with time. They drum again. Every other Saturday, in a room above the town library, men and women, boys and girls, some with full regalia, some in jeans and sneakers, sit in a circle and find the rhythm, together, not for show, not for tourists, for themselves. The drums are old now. One is stretched elk hide, stained from decades of use. Its heartbeat is steady. One woman, Leona Talltree, calls it the lungs of the ancestors. When the drum plays, she says, they know where to find us. But this chapter is not just about ceremony, it's about craft. On the southern edge of the reservation, a man builds canoes, not from fiberglass, not from kits, from white birch, pine pitch, and sinew, the way his ancestors did, centuries ago. His name is David Flint Eyes Paul. His workshop is a clearing ringed with cedar and riverstone. He strips bark slow, running his hand over the grain like a prayer, then shapes the frame from white ash, soaking, bending, binding. He learned the technique from a handwritten page found in a museum basement, then rewrote it with memory. Each canoe takes weeks, but when it floats, he says, it's like watching a ghost smile. Others are learning too. Monique James teaches foraging classes, wild leeks, ramps, fiddleheads. She says every plant has a story. She holds up a sprig of yarrow and says, "This is what my people used for cuts, not neosporin." Students follow her into the forest, not for exercise, but for reconnection. They collect responsibly. They give thanks. They ask permission from the land. That part matters most. Because to the Eastern Pequot, the land isn't property, it's relationship. They steward it, not with control, but with care. Gardens bloom now in places long abandoned. Not rows of corn and squash alone, but three sisters planting. Corn for height, beans for climbing, squash for shelter. This ancient agricultural system returns, not because it's trendy, but because it remembers what the soil forgot. And in community halls, no larger than one-room schools, elders teach sewing, beadwork, and cradleboard binding. Young hands fumble at first, but then, slowly, they remember what they never learned. One girl, Talia Dawn, age 12, sews her first bead pattern, a turtle, her great-grandmother's clan animal. She holds it up to the window and says, "I'm putting it on my jacket, so people know I'm Pequot." There is no hesitation, no apology, just declaration. No one handed her a recognition letter. No one granted her a certificate. She doesn't need one. She has the thread. She has the name. That is enough. This is what it means to live beyond the paper. To exist not because a government says you do, but because your bones say you do. Because your stories say you do. Because your hands still remember how to make fire in the dark. The Eastern Pequot do not wait for validation. They build without permission. They sing without license. They survive without applause. And in doing so, they offer a quiet kind of resistance, one that cannot be undone. Because when a people remember who they are, no ruling can erase it. No law can define it. No silence can swallow it. The paper may fade, but the fire still burns. It begins with wind, soft, like a mother humming to a child, moving through the canopy, brushing against the bark of ancient oaks and the young shoots of cedar. And if you listen, not with ears, but with memory, you'll hear something deeper. Not words, not voices, but presence. The forest remembers. It has always remembered. Long before the English ships carved scars into the shoreline. Long before treaties were written in ink that would fade into betrayal. Long before Pequot became a footnote in someone else's history book. The land knew them, and it still does. Here, in the shaded hollows of North Stonington, Connecticut, the trees still arch over trails that have no signs. They wind past moss-covered stones, through glens where water sings the same notes it did 500 winters ago. This land has not forgotten who walked here first, and neither have they. The Eastern Pequot remain, not as relics, not as whispers, but as people, living, working, teaching, raising children on the same soil that once cradled their ancestors. In the early morning, the mist curls low along the earth like a veil, and behind it, the sound of movement, soft footsteps, slow breath, a drumbeat against the ground. A woman bends over a tobacco patch, her hands caked in loam. She murmurs a prayer, not for crops, but for connection. She says the soil is kin. A boy, no older than 8, walks beside her. He carries water in a birch bark vessel, made last week in a workshop led by a tribal craftsman. The boy doesn't know how many generations his bloodline stretches. He only knows that his feet feel right here, that the ground under him feels like truth. Further in, where the old paths still cut narrow through laurel thickets, a group gathers in a clearing. There is no stage, no lighting, no audience. Just a circle. Elders and youth, men and women, passing a hand drum from one to the next. Each sings, some confidently, some with trembling voices, but every note is a declaration. We are still here. One elder speaks after a song. Her name is Agnes Firewalker. She's nearly 90. She was born before the tribe had a name on a federal list. She remembers hiding who she was. Now she stands tall and says, "The paper came and went, but the trees always knew us." That's the truth at the heart of this final chapter. The forest never stopped knowing. The land doesn't wait for court cases. It remembers every fire, every footprint, every whispered story told around a fire long gone cold. You can see it in the way the ground yields to moccasins. You can hear it in the rustle of leaves during a naming ceremony. You can feel it when a hawk circles overhead and someone points and says, "That's grandfather checking in." There are no monuments here, no grand plaques carved in marble. But if you kneel and press your ear to the earth, you'll hear something more powerful than any statue: the pulse, the root-deep echo of continuance. The Pequot were never erased. They were just quiet, watching, learning, surviving. While empires rose and fell, while boundaries shifted and names changed, they kept planting, singing, teaching. They kept returning to the woods. And now, in a time when so many seek connection, to land, to story, to something deeper, the Eastern Pequot offers something rare, a truth that never asked permission to endure. Children still swim in the streams their ancestors drank from. Their laughter blends with the sound of birdsong. Their shadows ripple on the same water that once held canoes made from bark and pitch. In a quiet corner of the reservation, an elder carves a turtle into a piece of driftwood. He doesn't say much. He just works. But the boy beside him watches every stroke. This is how knowledge survives. Not in museums, but in motion, in wood, in silence. The Pequot know that survival isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear feathers or raise banners. Sometimes, survival is a whisper. Sometimes, it's the hand that plants corn beside its sister bean. Sometimes, it's the voice that speaks one word of a half-forgotten language and teaches it to a niece. Sometimes, it's simply choosing to stay, to remain on the land, to return again and again to the forest that remembers you. The Eastern Pequot walk those paths today, not as ghosts, not as symbols, but as people, the ones who were not broken by war, not erased by paperwork, not defined by absence. They were always here. They still are. And as long as the trees stand, they will be. Because this isn't the end of a documentary, it's the continuation of a song, one that can't be silenced, one that lives in the soil, in the wind, and in the bloodlines that never broke. So if you ever walk these woods, listen. The leaves are speaking. The stones are watching. The forest remembers. There is a place where the mist never leaves, where the grey breath of the Pacific drifts through ancient trees, clinging to their bark like secrets. Here, at the edge of the continent, the sea does not rest. It churns and crashes and murmurs, an endless rhythm that has shaped both land and life. This is the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and along its northern shore, where the cold salt water meets the fur-lined bluffs of what we now call Washington State, there once stood a world untouched by conquest, a world ruled not by kings or borders, but by cedar and salmon, tide and story. This was Saklallam land, and for thousands of years, it was enough. In those days, before ships cast shadows on the horizon, before names were rewritten and laws imposed, the Jamestown Saklallam people lived in a rhythm older than maps. Their world was one of balance, not peace necessarily, for the sea never promised that, but of understanding. Understanding of the land, of the animals, of the wind's many voices. The cedar tree was their cathedral. It gave them everything: planks for longhouses, bark for weaving, and resin for sealing canoes. With stone adzes, they shaped great beams from trunks that had stood for centuries, carving not just shelter, but memory. A longhouse was more than wood and sweat. It was lineage in timber, each post a story, each notch a name. And just beyond the cedar groves, the sea waited. Every spring, the salmon came. Silver flashes cut through the coastal rivers, like blood returning to a heart. The Saklallam were waiting. With bone-tipped spears and woven nets, they honoured an agreement older than their grandparents. The fish gave themselves, and the people took only what they needed, smoking, drying, preserving for leaner months. The smoke curled through the rafters of the drying sheds, carrying the scent of preparation, of gratitude, of foresight. Canoes, sleek, narrow, curved like the ribs of a giant beast, slid across the water, driven by paddles carved with care. These were not mere vessels. Each canoe was a promise of return, of harvest, of safety. They hunted seal and whale when needed. They traded with neighbors up and down the Salish Sea, their carved prows gliding past cliffs and tide pools, guided by currents known only through generations of trial and prayer. Life moved with the seasons. In spring, new shoots emerged: devil's club, salmonberry, skunk cabbage. The women knew where to dig, what to leave, and what to bless. Children watched, learning not by lesson, but by rhythm: when to gather, when to burn, when to leave a grove untouched so it could breathe and return. In summer, they fished in earnest. The long days were filled with labor and laughter, the clang of stones, the scrape of hide, the hiss of water boiling over flame. Smokehouses lined the riverbanks, their cedar frames blackened with years of use. Every meal was a memory, every task a tether to something deeper than survival. This was not subsistence, it was reverence. In fall, they turned to the forest, hunting elk and black-tailed deer. The men moved silently, reading the trails like scripture. Footprints in mud, a broken branch, the droppings of a recent grazer. Their arrows, tipped in obsidian or bone, flew swiftly and sure. Meat was dried, hides scraped, sinew stretched, and saved for bowstrings and lashing. And in winter, the hardest season, they gathered close. The longhouse was the heart. Fires glowed along its spine, casting flickers on carved beams above. Elders spoke into the hush, their voices heavy with memory. Myths of Thunderbird and Transformer. Stories of how the rivers were formed, how the animals chose their shapes. These were not just tales. They were warnings, lessons, laughter wrapped in legend. They taught humility, and they taught defiance. They taught how to live, and above all, they taught that no one survives alone. The Saklallam knew hardship. Storms could smash canoes against the rocks. A failed hunt meant hunger. Sickness came in waves, fevers, injuries, bone-deep cold. But they endured because they endured together. A shared catch was never questioned. A healer's root bundle was opened freely. Every child belonged to the village, and every death was mourned by all. They carried no clocks, yet they knew the hour by the sun on the moss. They wrote no books, yet they could trace their ancestry back 15 generations. They mapped rivers by muscle memory and stars by the hush of waves at night. They were not primitive, they were precise. To survive in this landscape, wet, wild, unforgiving, you needed more than strength. You needed knowledge, you needed patience, and you needed to belong. Their technology was elegant. Fish traps made of split cedar stakes created pathways that funneled salmon with startling efficiency. Watertight baskets woven from spruce roots could boil stew using hot stones. Fire drills made from red cedar and hemlock were spun with skill that bordered on art. Each tool was a solution, shaped by generations who tested, failed, and finally mastered. And yet, it wasn't the tools that told the story. It was the people. A grandmother rubbing oil into her grandson's hair to protect against lice. A boy is learning to read the clouds before a storm. A hunter resting his palm on a cedar trunk before his journey, asking permission. These small acts of continuity wove a fabric too tight for the world to unravel easily. But far out at sea, sails were rising. Foreigners would come, and soon, with their iron nails and woolen coats, with strange tongues and deadlier diseases, with paper treaties and insatiable hunger for land. But none of that has happened yet. In this chapter of their story, the Jamestown Saklallam are sovereign, unwritten, and unbroken. They live where the cedars meet the sea, and the sea still listens, as wind rattles the branches and gulls circle above. The tide flats, the land, holds its breath. The mist thickens. A longhouse door opens, smoke drifts upward, and a story, centuries in the making, continues to unfold. One heartbeat, one paddle stroke, one cedar shaving at a time. Here, In the hush before history rewrites the names, the Sklallam are not surviving. They are thriving, and they are watching the horizon. The sea has no master, but the Sklallam knew how to speak to it, not in words, but in silence, in patience, in rhythm. The salt air carried no mercy, only truth. It salted their brows, calloused their hands, and stained their cedar garments stiff. But for those who listened, really listened, the sea became a teacher, a partner, a provider. Long before anchors bit into these shores, before maps carved up coastlines and rifles changed the stakes of survival, the Sklallam moved with the water like it was breath. They fished not from desperation, but from deep, inherited trust. Trust that the salmon would return, that the tides would rise and fall, that the ocean would remember them as they remembered it. They were called Naxwuslayim, the strong people. And the sea, with all its fury and gifts, shaped every part of their existence. Along the pebbled beaches and kelp-choked shallows, they hunted shellfish at low tide. Children learned to walk with baskets on their backs and their eyes to the ground, prying open butter clams and horse mussels, sifting through eelgrass for geoduck. The elders taught them the songs of respect, quiet chants whispered not for show, but to thank the spirit of the creature taken. Every gathering had a season, every tide a purpose. Razor clams were pulled with split cedar digging sticks, tools honed by centuries of repetition. And when the tides dropped low enough to expose the reef nets, entire families would gather to watch the careful operation. Woven fiber nets anchored by stone, timed with the moon, lifted with poles and muscle and breath. But it was the salmon, the heartfish, that truly defined their year. The Chinook, the coho, the sockeye, each came in waves, returning from the vast Pacific to the streams of their birth. To the Sklallam, their return was sacred. It wasn't merely a food source. It was a promise made good, a cycle held firm. They caught them in weirs, ingenious wooden structures built into the riverbeds, guiding fish into traps with a lattice of cedar stakes. With sharpened spears tipped in fire-hardened bone or antler, they stood waist-deep in glacial runoff, eyes locked on the silver flashes. Each strike was quick, deliberate. Waste was an insult. Overfishing was unthinkable. A single large salmon, cleaned and dried properly, could feed a family through winter's lean weeks. Its oils were medicine, its bones, tools. The skins, when stretched and dried, were sewn into pouches or waterproof liners. Processing was an art. Women knelt beside the smoking fires, blades, made from obsidian or mussel shell flicking through flesh with fluid grace. The fillets were laid on racks, cedar again, and smoked for hours, sometimes days, until the fish became something else entirely, hardened, preserved, portable. The smoke curled into the beams of the longhouses, mingling with the stories and memories already housed there. Their tools were carved from meaning as much as material. A simple fishing hook, often fashioned from bent yew or bone, might carry designs of salmon heads or the crescent moon. A canoe paddle might bear the image of an orca, silent protector of the deeper waters. Even their drying racks were sometimes inscribed with family crests, links to ancestors who had stood in the same river, cast the same nets. The canoes were their marvels, each one hewn from a single cedar trunk, some as long as 40 feet, designed for open ocean trade. Others are smaller, sleeker, suited to the shallow estuaries or tight turns of inland rivers. The building of a canoe wasn't just craftsmanship, it was ceremony. The tree was never cut in haste. Elders would speak to it first, offering thanks, asking permission. Then the long labor began, burning, adzing, scraping. Day after day, the canoe took shape, guided by the eye and hand of a carver who knew what balance felt like without measuring. The final step, steaming the wood over coals and bracing the hull open with crossbeams, gave the vessel its sleek, flared silhouette. It was a shape that cut through waves without effort. To see one of these canoes in motion, 5 men paddling in perfect unison, the prow carving a path through fog, was to witness poetry written in motion, and they went far. across the Salish Sea to trade with the Makah, the Suquamish, and the Haida. They brought dried fish, carved spoons, woven blankets, and obsidian blades. And they returned with copper, with stories, with memories of waters even rougher than their own. The spiritual realm of the S'Klallam was inseparable from this physical world. The sea had moods, the wind had names, the animals had voices, and the people knew how to listen. The thunderbird lived above the mountains, its wings stirring the air before storms. The transformer walked the earth in the time before humans, reshaping it with every step. Each ritual, each story, bound them to the waters they lived by. A new canoe was blessed with cedar boughs. A young boy catching his first salmon was given a necklace of fishbone, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. There was danger, always. A sudden storm could flip a canoe. A fog bank could erase the coastline like a wiped slate. Tidal currents could sweep even the strongest paddler into the throat of the strait. But the S'Klallam understood risk. They studied the clouds. They smelled the shift in the wind. They listened for the absence of birds, nature's own alarm. They had no compasses, no maps, but they knew where they were. By the pull of the tide, by the tilt of the sun through cedar branches, by the whisper of the wind against the waves. Knowledge wasn't taught through instruction, it was absorbed. A child learned to carve by watching a grandfather's hands, the way he cradled a blade, the way he turned the wood into something alive. A girl learned to harvest roots not from lectures, but from walking, season after season, across the same trails, watching which plants returned and which grew still. This was education by repetition, by presence, by humility. They didn't write their science in books, but in the soil. They didn't name their technologies, but they refined them endlessly. Smokehouses positioned with the prevailing wind, longhouses with vented roofs angled just right to release smoke but retain heat, paddle blades designed to flex slightly in the hand, reducing fatigue over long distances. We now call it sustainable engineering. They just called it living. To live here, where storms rolled in without warning, where food rotted within days if improperly stored, where winters were long and snow could bury trails, you had to adapt. You had to build tools that worked with nature, not against it. You had to know when to act and when to wait. You had to belong. The S'Klallam didn't conquer this land. They were carved by it. Each fish trap, each woven basket, each canoe was not an act of dominance. It was a gesture of balance, of asking and offering, of taking only what would return. They were people of the strong sea. And long before the strangers came, long before ink spilled across treaties and steel rails split the earth, they had already mastered something most civilizations never learn. That true survival isn't just endurance, it's harmony. And in the salt, the cedar, the stone, they left behind a blueprint still waiting to be remembered. The wind shifted, and though the cedar trees still whispered their ancient songs, and the tide still rolled across familiar beaches, something was different. The sea, that eternal partner of the S'Klallam people, had begun to carry strange messages, a new scent, a foreign timber, the glint of unfamiliar metals drifting just beyond the fog line. Whispers spread through the longhouses, not from fear, but from awareness. Something was coming, and it did not come quietly. The first signs weren't men, they were things. Bits of fabric woven tighter than any cedar bark, shards of glass polished like waterstone, beads, small, smooth, blue as glacier ice. Driftwood that wasn't cedar, but oak and fir, shaped by saws, not adzes. Then came the sails, massive, white and foreign, like clouds stitched with rope. They moved differently than canoes, slower to turn, but stubborn in their path. Spanish at first, their hulls creaking with iron and filled with a language that barked through brass tubes. They didn't linger long. Their maps were sketching the edges of empires, not friendships. Then came the British, bearing trade. Their arrival sent waves, not through the water, but through the fabric of S'Klallam life. They offered iron, muskets, mirrors, copper kettles that held heat like nothing before. In exchange, they wanted fur, beaver mostly, soft pelts to feed the European fashion fever thousands of miles away. To the Seclalam, it was an opportunity, a test, and a warning. Trade was not new to them. They had traded for generations, with Coast Salish neighbors, with island people across the strait, with those deep inland. But this was different. These newcomers carried more than goods. They carried consequences. They called the land terra nullius, empty land, though it pulsed with memory and footsteps older than their homelands. The Seclalam were not fooled by flattery or coin. They watched, they measured. A man named Thais, a skilled canoe carver from the Dungeness River, once warned his nephew, "Trade your salmon, but not your rivers. Trade your bark, but not your trees." His words would echo louder with every ship that dropped anchor. The British were soon joined by American traders, rougher men with restless eyes. Their ships were smaller, faster, crewed by sailors who'd seen death on every ocean. They offered muskets with triggers finer than British flintlocks. They brought sugar, tea, wool. But they also brought competition, exploitation, and disease. Smallpox arrived without a name. No sales, no warning. The first signs were innocuous: a child's fever, a rash, a cough deeper than usual. Then came the pustules, red, blistering, spreading like wildfire down a family's skin. By the time the shamans recognized it, it was already too late. The smokehouses that once cured fish now held the dead. Bodies wrapped in woven mats were floated to sea or buried deep in forest groves. But the disease followed. Whole villages emptied in weeks. Elders, the keepers of story, of ritual, of the ancient pathways through time, were struck hardest. Without them, memory itself faltered. One survivor, a young woman named Stayaku, later told her son, "Our hands remembered what our minds forgot. That is how we survived." The Seclalam adapted. They always had. But this was different. This wasn't the hunger of a hard winter or the fury of a rogue wave. It was invisible, cruel, and relentless. It respected no treaties, no kinship. It traveled on hands and breath and touched even the isolated fishing camps. Before a single treaty had been signed, before any official line was drawn in soil or ink, the balance had shifted. Still, not all was surrender. They refused to be erased. In the face of grief, they gathered tighter. Knowledge that could have been lost, medicinal uses for skunk cabbage, burial chants, net tying methods, was taught faster, spread farther. Children were given names early, and those names were spoken often, as if to anchor them to the world. Shamans, many weakened by the very sickness they could not cure, turned inward, invoking ancestral powers, isolating the sick with cedar smoke and sacred ash. In some cases, entire longhouses were burned to stop the spread. A brutal decision, but one rooted in survival. Meanwhile, the traders kept coming. Ships returned with more regularity. Some brought missionaries who spoke of heaven but dismissed the spirits of the trees and the tide. Others brought surveyors, quiet men with measuring chains, drawing lines no one had asked for. Every arrival came with tension. The Seclalam took what was useful, but never gave more than they could afford to lose. They learned quickly how to bargain. A blanket was never just a blanket. It was a symbol, a signal, a weapon if needed. Iron was valued, but not above honor. A British captain once insulted a Seclalam elder by offering a trade of gunpowder for a sacred paddle carved in mourning. The elder, unmoved, shattered the paddle against a stone and walked away. "We have lived longer than your powder," he said. "We will live after it." In the inlets and bays, the people watched as ships brought not just trade, but settlers. And with them came fences, claimed land, built roads, and laws that had no roots in cedar, or salmon, or sky. But even then, the Seclalam held firm. They formed smaller camps farther from the trade posts. They used their canoes not just for fishing, but for escape, for reconnaissance, for survival. They mapped the newcomers just as they once mapped the tides, noting their weaknesses, their rhythms, their language. Among them, a man named Haliu. He was not a warrior in the traditional sense, but he became one in the shadow of encroachment. Fluent in both Chinook trade jargon and English, he became an interpreter, not for the settlers, but for his people. He translated letters, intercepted plans, and warned of settlements that would push towards Saklallam land. His voice, calm and deliberate, was one of the first to urge preparation, not for war, but for endurance. And so the Saklallam endured. They rebuilt what they could. They buried their losses. They memorized the faces of the newcomers, not with hatred, but with intent. They learned their tools, their weaknesses, their greed. They saw now the shadows in the wake of every ship. It was not all darkness. Some traders were fair. Some missionaries brought medicine that helped. Some sailors even stayed, marrying into the tribe and learning the old ways. But the foundation had shifted. The tides were no longer predictable. The sea, once a perfect partner, now carried ghosts. Yet the Saklallam did not abandon it. They still fished, still carved, still told stories at night beneath smoke-darkened beams. But now, there was a new story, whispered with caution, the tale of a changing world. A world where survival no longer meant knowing the forest or the fish alone, but knowing the intentions of strangers. A world where the enemy had no face, only fever. Where the line between trade and trap blurred daily. Where sovereignty was something that would no longer be assumed. It would have to be defended. And so they watched. And they remembered. And they waited. The long canoes still cut across the water at dawn, paddles rising like wings. The children still chased gulls along the sand, and the cedar still whispered to those who knew how to hear. But in the background, always now, was the sound of sails, and in their wake, shadows. By the mid-1800s, the air along the Strait of Juan de Fuca had changed. Not just the scent of wood smoke or the tang of salt, but something deeper, something harder to name. The old trails still wound through the forest, the tides still curled into the estuaries, but the pressure was rising. It came with boots, with maps, with the hiss of ink on parchment and the scratch of pens that held more power than muskets. And with it came men who had already decided what this land would become. Their names were not remembered for their generosity, but for what they took. Governor Isaac Stevens, appointed to oversee the Washington Territory, arrived with a single goal: land acquisition, swift, decisive, final. He carried the authority of the United States government, a country growing westward like a spreading fire. And he came with treaties, stacks of them, pre-written, preordained, and waiting only for the marks of tribal leaders. The Saklallam knew what was coming before the ink dried. Word travelled fast along the coastal camps. From the Nisqually to the Suquamish to the lower Elwha, it became clear: sign or be forced to vanish. Stevens summoned the tribes to meet on the shores near Hadskus, now called Point No Point, a fitting name for a negotiation already decided. It was January 1855. Rain drummed the shoulders of cedar cloaks. Elders sat cross-legged in wet sand as fire pits hissed under grey skies. Across from them, federal representatives stood dry beneath canvas tents, their boots sunk in driftwood, their eyes scanning the horizon like it already belonged to them. They offered gifts, blankets, tin cups, flour. They promised protection, schools, medicine. They spoke of peace, of shared prosperity. But their voices were slick with oil, polished and hollow. The land, they said, would still belong to the Saklallam in spirit. They could hunt, fish, gather, just not own. But the Saklallam didn't believe in owning the land to begin with. They belonged to it. That was the difference, and that was the danger. Behind the speeches, behind the handshakes and translated words, there was a truth no one wanted to speak. This wasn't negotiation. This was erasure by signature. Under the terms of the Treaty of Point No Point, the The Siklallam, Chimakum, and Skokomish were to cede their homelands, millions of acres of ancestral territory, and relocate to a single reservation. Forests they'd walked for generations, river mouths that fed their winter stores, burial grounds lined with cedar prayer posts, all gone, in theory, with the stroke of a pen. Some leaders signed, pressured, misinformed, misled. Others signed out of exhaustion, a quiet surrender wrapped in survival instinct. But not all, not the Jamestown Siklallam. They listened, they watched, and then they stood still. A small group, fewer than 100, refused to leave their lands. They had seen what happened when people were uprooted, not just physically, but spiritually. When the land you buried your mother was no longer yours to walk. When the river that fed your children became property to be fenced and logged. When your songs no longer echoed in your own forests. For the Jamestown Siklallam, to leave was to vanish. Their leader at the time, a man remembered only as Sukswa, Knox W, which means he who holds ground, spoke little, but when he did, it carried weight. "We have always lived where the river meets the sea," he said. "If the cedar cannot root in stone, then neither can we." So they stayed. They became, in the eyes of the government, landless, non-reservation Indians, without formal recognition, without legal title, without a place on any map. But they were not without land, because they refused to abandon it. They clung to the coastline, to the fog-wrapped forests of the Dungeness, to the shallow bays where eelgrass danced like fingers of the ancestors. They lived in scattered camps, built homes just beyond the eye of government patrols, fished in the same rivers under the cover of morning mist. It was defiance, quiet, steady, unwavering. But it came at a cost. Without recognition, there was no protection. Siklallam homes were burned to clear land for settlers. Canoes were confiscated under new maritime laws. Elders were arrested for harvesting clams outside authorized zones, places they had gathered food since time immemorial. A child could be taken for not attending a missionary school. A fisherman could be jailed for casting a net into his own ancestral waters. One morning in the summer of 1867, a young Siklallam man named Kawats was pulled from his canoe by federal agents while checking his fish traps. The charge: illegal fishing. His nets were destroyed. His boat, a gift carved by his grandfather, was chained and dragged ashore. He walked home, 10 miles, silent, blood on his knuckles. He never fished again. The treaties, those fragile sheets of paper, began to show their cracks. Promises made were not promises kept. Schools never opened. Medicine never came. The land, instead of being shared, was parceled off, sold, logged, stripped. And yet, the Jamestown Siklallam persisted. They learned to bend without breaking. They hired translators, taught their children both Siklallam and English, navigated legal systems not made for them. They built alliances with sympathetic settlers, traded goods to stay afloat, and carved a shadow existence within a world that refused to acknowledge them. And they remembered. The longhouses may have burned, the old trails may have vanished beneath wagon ruts, but the names remained. The stories still echoed in the early morning fog, in the hush of cedar boughs swaying above burial grounds hidden beneath alder groves. They buried their dead where the treaties said they no longer belonged. They raised their children on land the government had claimed. And still, they sang the songs. Even in the coldest winters, the drum never fell silent. The Treaty of Point No Point may have declared their absence, but the Jamestown Siklallam never left. Their refusal to sign wasn't just an act of resistance. It was an act of survival, a refusal to allow their history to be rewritten in a foreign hand, a refusal to vanish. Years would pass, decades. A new generation would rise, one that would take that defiance and turn it into recognition, land ownership, legal sovereignty. But that would come later. For now, they simply stayed, against law, against pressure, against the tide. And in doing so, they carved out something far rarer than land on paper: They kept their home, even as the smoke of broken treaties rose into the sky. The tide was changing, not quickly, not loudly, but beneath the surface, something powerful stirred, the kind of shift only those who have survived storms recognize. It had been nearly 2 decades since the Treaty of Point No Point. 18 long years of fighting without weapons, surviving without recognition, and rebuilding without support. The Jamestown S'Klallam people had endured, quietly, stubbornly, on land the government insisted was no longer theirs. They fished the same rivers, buried their dead in the same groves, and raised their children in the shadow of lost promises. But even endurance eventually must take shape. And in 1874, it did, with a man named Cheechmahan. To the white world, he was James Balch. To his people, he was something more. Chief James Balch was not a warrior in the way stories often demand. He didn't lead raids or raise weapons. His power came from vision, a fierce, clear knowing of what had to be done. He had watched his people live without protection for nearly a generation. He had seen the way laws were bent to take, never to give. He had watched neighbors disappear, some to reservations, others to silence. But Balch didn't believe in waiting for rescue. He believed in reclaiming. At a time when native people were barred from citizenship, when courts viewed them as wards of the state, when indigenous ownership of property was considered both illegal and absurd, Balch gathered the S'Klallam together and did the unthinkable. He proposed buying back their land, not demanding it, not petitioning for it, but purchasing it with dollars, deeds, and strategy. It was a radical idea, to buy back what had been stolen, to use the settlers' system to restore a truth older than their courts. But Balch knew the language of survival had changed. Guns and treaties hadn't saved them. Maybe ledgers could. The elders were cautious. Some thought it impossible. How could people stripped of legal standing buy land from those who never acknowledged their right to it? But others saw the brilliance. This wasn't about asking for place. It was seizing it, legally and permanently. The people began to pool their resources. Fish profits, carved goods, traded furs. Everything of value was counted, saved, stored. Women wove cedar baskets and blankets for sale. Men fished longer into the night, sold more to trading posts, gathered more shellfish than ever before. Every coin mattered. There was no ceremony, no feast, just quiet, determined effort, $1 at a time. Then, in 1874, a year when the US government still debated whether natives could own themselves, let alone property, James Balch made the purchase. 210 acres. The land sat just east of Dungeness Spit, tucked between the salt marshes and the spruce-covered ridges. It wasn't the entirety of their ancestral territory, but it was enough. A foothold on stolen soil, a legal home, a place where no settler, no surveyor, no bureaucrat could tell them to leave. It became Jamestown, named not for conquest, but for defiance. Here, they did what generations had done before, but now with new stakes. They built homes, not scattered huts, but structures rooted in permanence. They carved canoes, gathered bark, fished, hunted, harvested. But they also did something revolutionary. They existed within the system that had tried to erase them and refused to disappear. Balch oversaw the establishment of a community that didn't just survive outside of federal jurisdiction, it thrived. With no federal assistance, no reservation status, and no outside funding, they built schools, governed themselves, and protected their fishing rights through generations of court challenges and tribal advocacy. He proved that sovereignty did not need permission. It could be declared through action, through ownership, through presence. And yet, the battle never truly ended. Jamestown was seen by many as a legal anomaly, a loophole. It didn't fit the neat boxes drawn by colonial law. They were a tribe without recognition, a nation without treaty protection, a people who had bought their homeland but were still denied its full legitimacy. But they endured, because of what Balch started. He died in 1887, not with a statue or a marble grave, just a quiet resting place near the bay he had reclaimed. But his legacy whispered through every cedar post and tide-worn dock, through the names passed down and the stories shared around firelight. Jamestown wasn't just a village, it was an idea. A declaration in timber and soil that said, "We are still here." And over the years, that whisper grew louder. In 1981, more than a century after that first purchase, the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe was finally, formally recognized by the United States government. Recognition came not as a gift, but as a long overdue admission that the people who had survived treaties, disease, erasure, and law had never gone anywhere. They had built something the world couldn't ignore. Today, Jamestown stands as one of the few native communities in the United States that purchased its own land in the face of dispossession. A place where sovereignty was not handed down from above, but risen up from below, carved in cedar, counted in coins, held fast by hands that refused to let go. James Balch didn't raise a fist, he raised a deed. And in doing so, he did what wars and protests could not. He created permanence. A place where the S'Klallam could gather not in exile, but in power. A place where survival wasn't about fleeing, but returning. To the same shores, the same tide pools, the same towering cedars where the ancestors still walk at dusk. Jamestown rose not from conquest, but from refusal. Refusal to vanish. Refusal to accept the lines drawn on maps. Refusal to be anything but whole. And through that quiet, unshakable resistance, they found something far more lasting than land. They found home, not taken, not given, reclaimed. The river never forgot. Even when concrete dams bit into its banks, when barbed wire coiled across the shallows, when the nets were seized and the names called out in courtrooms, the river remembered. It remembered the hands that carved weirs from cedar stakes, the songs sung at the first salmon feast, the children who learned the rhythm of the tides before they learned words. For the S'Klallam people, salmon was not a resource, it was a relative. It fed the body and the soul, tied kinship to season, and gave meaning to the cycles of return. It was memory made flesh, silver-scaled, river-born, eternal. But by the dawn of the 20th century, the river no longer belonged to the people who had walked beside it for generations. State agents had taken over its future, with pens, patrol boats, and enforcement officers who arrived not with understanding, but with laws. New laws, unfamiliar laws, laws that made criminals of the river's oldest guardians. In the name of conservation, and, more quietly, in the service of industry, Washington state began enforcing restrictions on salmon fishing that ignored indigenous rights. Net fishing was banned in many areas. Weirs, the traditional wooden traps engineered with generational precision, were dismantled. Licenses were required for access to ancestral rivers. And the S'Klallam, like so many coastal tribes, were told their treaty rights did not matter anymore. But the people remembered what was written. The Treaty of Point No Point, though forged under coercion, guaranteed the right of taking fish at usual and accustomed grounds and stations, in common with all citizens of the territory. That phrase, buried in the legal language of a document nearly forgotten by the settlers who imposed it, became the foundation of a battle that would stretch across generations. By the 1960s, the salmon wars had begun. S'Klallam fishers, joined by other Coast Salish tribes, stood their ground, not in the halls of government, but on the riverbanks where their grandparents had fished. They refused to stop casting their nets. They refused to dismantle their weirs. And when the state came to arrest them, they didn't run. They invited cameras. It became a war not of weapons, but of visibility. A man named Wu Yelum, known in English as David Charles, led a group of fishers along the Dungeness River. For years, they had been fishing in secret, returning home under cover of night with steelhead and coho hidden beneath cedar mats. But Charles was tired of hiding. In 1967, he and 5 others staged a fish-in, a public act of civil disobedience, where they dropped their nets in defiance of the law. State game wardens arrived within hours. There were no weapons, no violence, just nets, canoes, and a cold wind cutting across the water. But the arrests were swift. The nets were confiscated. The fish, caught with knowledge older than the nation itself, were tossed aside like evidence. They were charged, fined, threatened with jail time. But Charles had made his point. The next week, 10 more fishers arrived, then 30, then national media. Civil rights leaders began showing up, recognizing the struggle for what it was, not just about salmon, but sovereignty. The rivers became battlegrounds. Each net set in the water was a declaration. We never surrendered this right. Game wardens began conducting nighttime raids, slashing nets, impounding boats, sometimes breaking into homes looking for illegal catch. Fishers were followed, harassed, ticketed. Elders were dragged into courtrooms. Children watched their parents stand trial for harvesting what their ancestors had survived on for thousands of years. It wasn't just about food. It was about being erased. In 1970, a turning point came, not in the river, but in the courtroom. The United States, under pressure and with new awareness of native treaty violations, filed a case, United States versus Washington. The goal was clear, to resolve, once and for all, whether the treaties signed in the 1850s still carried legal weight. The case became a flashpoint. Dozens of tribes joined. So did the state of Washington, arguing that the fish belonged to all citizens equally and that special rights for indigenous people were outdated. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers in suits faced off against tribal elders in ribbon shirts. Expert witnesses brought maps, documents, fish biology charts. The tribes brought memory. One elder from the Jamestown S'Klallam was asked on the stand if he could define what usual and accustomed grounds meant. He simply said, "Where my grandfather fished, where I fish now, the same stones, the same current." It was more than testimony, it was truth. And then, in 1974, came the ruling. Judge George Bolt, after reviewing the evidence and treaty language, issued a decision that sent shockwaves across the state. Tribes were entitled to up to 50% of the harvestable fish in their traditional fishing grounds. The treaty rights were not symbolic. They were binding, enforceable, and paramount. The Bolt decision didn't just affirm fishing rights, it affirmed existence. Suddenly, the same S'Klallam fishers who had been arrested as criminals were recognized as co-managers of the fisheries. Their knowledge, once dismissed as superstition, was now part of state policy. Their nets returned, their weirs rebuilt, but the scars remained. Families had been torn apart, livelihoods lost, young men jailed for honoring ancestral responsibility. The rivers still bore the memory of dragged nets and broken treaties, and salmon, once teeming, had grown fewer. Their numbers dwindled not by tribal harvest, but by commercial overfishing, damming, and pollution. Still, the S'Klallam endured. They turned victory into stewardship. Tribal fisheries departments were formed, biologists trained, elders consulted, habitat restored, and through it all, the salmon returned. Fewer, yes, but still returning. The cycle still turning. In Jamestown, the children learned the old ways again. How to cure salmon over cedar fires, how to read the tide, how to weave nets from natural fiber, not as nostalgia, but as survival. One morning in 1986, David Charles stood on the same riverbank where he'd been arrested 2 decades earlier. His grandson, just 8 years old, was casting a net into the current. Charles didn't say much, just watched. When the boy pulled in a single coho, silver and gasping in the morning light, he smiled and said, "He came back." So did we. The river never forgot, and neither did the people who fought for the right to return to it. The salmon, even now, continue their journey upstream, slipping past concrete, dodging turbines, leaping waterfalls. Their instinct is older than memory, stronger than steel, and in every flick of their tail, the S'Klallam see a reflection of themselves. They too were nearly lost. They too fought currents not of water, but of politics, prejudice, and erasure. And like the salmon, they returned, not just to fish, but to lead, to teach, to remember. In the rivers of the Pacific Northwest, every drop holds a history. Every net cast by S'Klallam hands is more than sustenance. It's testimony, it's defiance, it's home. The wind along the Strait of Juan de Fuca carries more than salt and cold. It carries voices, sometimes soft, like a whisper beneath the trees, other times sharp, like a cedar branch snapping underfoot, but always there. For generations, the S'Klallam spoke in rhythm with the land. Their language, like their footsteps, followed the shape of the coastlines. Fluid, tidal, grounded. Every word held a teaching, every phrase, a story. It was not just how they spoke, it was how they remembered. But the silence came, not all at once, not like a wave crashing in, more like a tide going out, slow and steady, until one day the sand was bare and the shells no longer sang. The silence came through boarding schools. In the late 1800s and into the early 20th, S'Klallam children were taken, sometimes by force, sometimes by pressure, and placed in distant institutions. Their hair was cut, their names changed, their words punished. Speaking S'Klallam meant beatings, isolation, shame. "You'll never succeed with that savage tongue," one boy was told in 1922. He was 9. He didn't speak again for days, and when he did, it was in English. That was the goal, not just to educate, but to erase. By the 1950s, the language had nearly vanished. Fewer than a dozen fluent speakers remained. Most were elders who carried their words like fragile heirlooms, too precious to risk, but too heavy to bear alone. And yet, even then, the wind remembered. And so did the people. In the 1970s, as the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe gained federal recognition and began rebuilding its foundation brick by brick, a deeper truth emerged. Sovereignty meant more than land. It meant identity. And identity, stripped of language, could not hold. They had kept their rivers. They had kept their homes. Now they needed to keep their voice. It began with Exchait, the breath, the sound of a language reborn. A single cassette tape, discovered in the dusty archives of an old Washington university, recorded a 1941 interview with an elder named Agnes Martin, one of the last to speak S'Klallam fluently. On the tape, her voice trembled, weathered, but clear, as she described a cedar basket in her lap, each word chosen with care. That tape became a lifeline. Linguists from the University of Washington worked alongside tribal elders and cultural leaders. They gathered what they could, scattered words from census notes, missionary transcripts, forgotten diaries, even the memories of those who had been punished for speaking them. The rebuilding wasn't fast. It wasn't easy, but it was sacred. Elders like Tazia, who had grown up understanding S'Klallam but had never dared speak it aloud, returned to the language like a song once forgotten. They practiced by candlelight, taped note cards to their kitchen walls, whispered greetings into the mirror. "I feel like I'm calling my grandmother back," one elder said. "Every word I speak," she answers. Soon, the youth began to follow. In 1999, the Jamestown S'Klallam opened their first language class. Only 3 students showed up the first night. A teenager named Lily, who had grown up hearing only English. A grandfather named John, trying to reclaim something lost. And a young father named Derek, who wanted to teach his newborn son more than just English lullabies. They began with numbers, colors, names of animals, chochus, blue jay, sexku ngeng, moon, chalsneng, we are strong. The room was filled with nervous laughter, stumbles, long pauses. But each session built confidence. Memory awakened. The sounds, so long buried beneath generations of shame, began to rise. They were learning more than vocabulary. They were learning how their ancestors saw the world. In Sklallam, there is no word for ownership in the Western sense. You do not own a tree. You are in relationship with it. You do not control the land. You move with it. Time bends differently in the language. Stories are not told in the past tense, but in a spiraling present, always returning. It reshaped how the youth saw themselves. One child, age 6, stood before the tribal council and introduced herself entirely in Sklallam. Her voice clear, her back straight. Chalseya? Lily, she said. My name is Lily. I am of this land. The room fell silent. Elders wept. It wasn't about fluency. It was about return. In 2003, the tribe partnered with the local school district to offer Sklallam language courses for credit. The first time in history that a language once banned in schools was now being taught in one. Students wore ribbon shirts and skirts to class. Laughter rang through the hallways as they tested new phrases on each other. The language was no longer hiding. It was living again. The revival didn't stop at classrooms. Songs once lost returned to drums. Ceremonial speeches, once whispered in back rooms, echoed across longhouse floors. Births were now greeted in Sklallam, names given that held the shape of mountains, rivers, and memories. At funerals, elders spoke in the language of their grandparents, guiding loved ones home not in English, but in truth. And technology became an unlikely ally. In 2010, the tribe released a digital Sklallam dictionary, over 1,000 words, recorded and pronounced by fluent speakers. A mobile app followed, allowing anyone, anywhere, to carry the language in their pocket. The winds of modernity, once seen as a threat, now carried the words even farther. Today, the Sklallam language is still fragile, but no longer fading. There are now speakers, teachers, children singing lullabies their great-grandmothers never got to hear. The language, once nearly extinguished by policy and prejudice, now flickers like firelight across generations. And it has changed the tribe, not just in how they speak, but how they stand. Taller, stronger, more rooted. Because to speak your own language is not just to remember, it is to resist, to rebuild, to return. The wind still carries those words. Between the trees, across the tide, through the mouths of children who were never supposed to speak them. And when they do, when they say, Aye, Naxuslayam, I am Sklallam, the land listens and answers. The language didn't vanish in a single night. It slipped away like mist between the pines, slow, almost imperceptible, until there were no children left who could name the wind. No lullabies carried through longhouses. No prayers spoken before the first salmon feast. The words that had once shaped the Sklallam world, words for cedar, for tide, for the hush before dawn, began to fall silent. What happens when a language fades? When the breath of a people's memory is choked beneath history's weight? In the case of the Sklallam, it did not begin with forgetting. It began with force. By the early 1900s, government boarding schools had become instruments of erasure. Sklallam children were taken from their homes, stripped of their names, and punished for speaking the only language they had ever known. Elders called it the hush generation, those who returned home unable to say mother, or river, or I remember, in their own tongue. Some elders kept the language alive in secret. They whispered it between berry bushes, folded it into stories told at twilight, buried it in song. But they stopped teaching it aloud. The risk was too great. For decades, the sound of the Sklallam language existed only in memory, in the spaces between silence. By the 1970s, fewer than 6 fluent speakers remained. All were elderly. All carried the burden of being the last breath of something ancient. And yet even then, the words refused to die. A turning point came not with a shout, but with a whisper, crackling through an old cassette tape unearthed in the basement archives of a university. The year was 1977. A young tribal councilman named Peter Adams had been researching his ancestry when he came across a box of recordings made by a field linguist in the 1940s. One of the tapes, yellowed and brittle, bore the name of a Saklallam elder, Agnes Martin. He played the tape. What came through the static was a voice aged but resolute. Agnes was describing the seasons, how to tell the coming of fall by the cedar's scent, how spring carried the breath of new salmon. She named birds, plants, spirits. She laughed between phrases, and though her words were measured, they danced with rhythm. It was the language of the wind. Peter wept. He brought the tape home and played it for his mother. She recognized the voice instantly. "She used to sing that song when we were children," she said. "I thought I had forgotten it." They played it again and again, and then they wrote every word down. The revival began with fragments. Linguists were brought in, not to instruct, but to listen. Elders gathered, some who had not spoken the language in decades, offering single words, broken sentences, old hymns passed down in dreams. There were arguments over pronunciation, laughter over forgotten phrases, tears when a lost word was finally remembered. The language was brittle, but alive. In 1992, the Jamestown Saklallam launched its first language revitalization program. It was housed in a one-room office, lit by fluorescent bulbs and the fierce will of those who refused to let the past slip away. They named it Schinax-W, the place where breath returns. Classes began with elders sitting beside youth. No one was fluent. Everyone was a student. They began with the names of things: chop, hours, salmon, weight, fire, squai, spirit. Each word opened a door, not just to meaning, but to memory. In English, a tree is a tree. In Saklallam, it is Naxwakate, the giver of the long breath, a name that reminds you of the cedar's use in shelter, warmth, and ceremony. Language, they discovered, was not just communication, it was worldview. The children who once only knew mountain began to call it Staksat, and in doing so, learned to see it as a living ancestor. They stopped calling the bay water and started calling it Chaku, the skin of the world. In this way, the people didn't just learn the language, they remembered who they were. Technology became a bridge. In 2004, the tribe released a digital dictionary with over 1,000 Saklallam words, each pronounced by native speakers. They launched an app, audio recordings, flashcards, songs on YouTube. School children began each day with "Yay, Chax W, good morning." A generation that had once been punished for their words now wore them proudly on their tongues, and the language began to shift from survival to celebration. Weddings included vows in Saklallam. Funeral rites returned to the ancestral tongue. In longhouses, speeches rang out with confidence. Elders who had once feared to speak it aloud now sang lullabies to newborns. It wasn't always smooth. Some words had been lost. Others existed in multiple dialects. Fluency remained a mountain still being climbed. But the climb was worth it. In 2017, Lily Charles, a 17-year-old student from Jamestown, gave her graduation speech entirely in Saklallam. She stood beneath cedar rafters, wind tugging at her ribbon skirt, and began, "Haye, Lily Chats W. Chalisnung, I am Lily, we are strong." The room fell silent, then thundered with applause, because in her voice echoed generations, those who had whispered in the dark, who had been silenced in classrooms, who had buried their language in hope. And now, at last, it had returned. Today, the Jamestown Saklallam language program has over 100 active learners, from toddlers to elders. Each carries a piece of the breath that once seemed lost. Together they form a living river of memory, flowing backward and forward through time. What happens when a language fades? If you're lucky, if you're determined, it comes back. Word by word, voice by voice, wind by wind. The wind through the forest still smelled of cedar. Beneath the towering evergreens, near the shadowed places where the ferns grow thick and undisturbed, there are trails that carry more than footprints. They carry memory. They carry medicine. For the Seclalam people, healing did not begin with pills or policies. It began with bark soaked in rainwater, with roots lifted gently from the earth, with chants murmured beneath the breath, hands moving in rhythm with the tide and the moon. Long before clinics, long before hospitals, there were women, knowledge keepers, who walked these woods with baskets on their backs and the well-being of their people in their care. One of them was Exwasam, known in English as Rose Mary Tallis. She lived in the early 1900s, when the weight of assimilation bore down heavily, when speaking your language or practicing traditional medicine could bring punishment. But Rose Mary never stopped. In the early mornings, she would kneel beside the marsh, collecting skunk cabbage root for poultices. At night, she'd boil devil's club in a cedar pot, the steam curling like ghosts through the cabin rafters. She knew the rhythm of the land, which berries strengthened the heart, which moss soothed the fever, which songs called the sickness out. She once said, "The earth gives if you remember how to ask." But the world around her had begun to forget. With the rise of settler medicine came dismissiveness, federal agents who labeled traditional healers as superstitious, missionaries who demanded the abandonment of pagan ways. By the mid-20th century, much of the Seclalam's ancestral medicine had been pushed underground or lost entirely. And yet, even then, the healing roots held firm. When the Jamestown Seclalam began the long road toward federal recognition in the 1970s, it wasn't just a political act. It was a declaration of survival, of sovereignty, yes, but also of responsibility. They knew that a people cannot reclaim their future unless they also care for their wounded present. Health, true health, would not come from outside. It would have to be grown from within. In 1990, that vision began to take shape with the founding of the Jamestown Family Health Clinic. It was a modest building, cedar-paneled, nestled not far from the ancestral fishing grounds of Sequim Bay. But its walls carried something deeper than drywall and insulation. They carried intention. Here, the Seclalam would reclaim care, not as a service delivered, but as a relationship restored. At the heart of the clinic was a philosophy rooted in balance. Western medicine had its tools, antibiotics, diagnostics, surgery. But the Seclalam knew that healing also came from story, from ceremony, from understanding the context of a wound, not just its symptoms. Dr. Sarah Klein was among the first physicians hired. A non-native doctor trained in both allopathic and integrative medicine, she remembered walking into the clinic and seeing an elder burning sweetgrass in the lobby. "I was taught to sterilize the air," she said. But here, the air itself was sacred. From the beginning, the clinic functioned differently. Patients were not treated as numbers. Time was taken. Questions were asked about family, community, the state of the soul. No one was turned away. Behind the exam rooms, a traditional garden bloomed: feverfew, yarrow, nettle, and wild mint. Medicine women, trained in both the old ways and new certifications, harvested these plants with reverence. They taught young apprentices the stories behind each one. "This one," an elder whispered, holding a sprig of Oregon grape, "is for clearing the liver and reminding the heart to be brave." The merging of traditions wasn't always easy. There were debates, disagreements between doctors and traditional healers, Western clinicians wary of unproven remedies, elders who refused to enter buildings with fluorescent lights. But dialogue continued, respect deepened, and slowly, a model of care emerged that was not just about healing, but about identity. They called it cultural medicine, not because it excluded science, but because it remembered that people are more than bodies. That trauma lives in the blood, yes, but also in the silence passed down from parent to child. that the ache in the bones sometimes comes from history, not injury. Mental health care, once taboo, became a cornerstone. Counselors were trained in generational trauma. PTSD treatment was offered to boarding school survivors. Talking circles were held for those grieving the loss of language, land, and loved ones. A Sklallam youth named James, age 17, once came to the clinic not for a physical wound, but because he hadn't spoken to his father in 2 years. He said he felt hollow. The counsellor didn't start with a diagnosis. She took him to the beach, told him to watch the waves. Grief is like the tide, she said. It leaves, it returns, but it never forgets where you are. Over time, James returned too, finding strength in ceremony, in cedar, in the words of his ancestors. By the early 2000s, the clinic had expanded, offering dental care, addiction treatment, elder outreach, prenatal support. They added telehealth long before it became common. Medical students from across the nation came to study this hybrid model, modern infrastructure grounded in ancestral knowledge. But the true victories weren't in spreadsheets or statistics. They were in moments. A diabetic elder learning to cook traditional meals again. A child receiving a vaccine beneath a mural of salmon and moons. A mother, once shamed for using herbal teas, now teaching her daughter to do the same. And always, the roots, still gathered in early morning fog, still soaked and boiled, still laid with care across aching joints or tired spirits. In 2018, the clinic was recognized as a national model for tribal healthcare innovation. But inside the community, the recognition wasn't needed. They had already known. Health, for the Sklallam, was never just the absence of disease. It was the presence of dignity, of language, of belonging. It was in the way an elder's hand rested on a child's shoulder, in the way cedar smoke curled through a sterile room, rewriting the scent of healing, in the way a people, once told their ways were dying, had made medicine from survival itself. They call it survivance, the act of enduring not merely through resistance, but through expression, through creation, through the defiant choice to thrive in full color, not grayscale. And in Jamestown, that survivance hums beneath every heartbeat, in every patient's story, in every whispered prayer, in every root pulled gently from the earth, still warm with memory. The cedar trees stood like sentinels, silent, soaked in rain, their roots twisted deep into the earth of the Olympic Peninsula. For the Sklallam people, these giants were not just timber. They were teachers, providers, ancestors. And from them, entire worlds were carved, homes, tools, vessels, stories. It was here, where salt met forest and storm clouds brewed low over the mountains, that survival demanded more than strength. It demanded knowledge. Bushcraft wasn't a skill, it was a sacred inheritance. In the dense canopy, light filtered through like threads of silver, but the ground remained damp year-round. Fire was essential, and fire was hard. The Sklallam mastered its art in conditions where most would fail. In the wet hush of the rainforest, they split cedar logs to reach the dry heartwood within. They carried bundles of pitch from fir and spruce, each resin-soaked shaving wrapped in bark and tucked beneath the armpit to stay dry during travel. Fire kits were passed from parent to child. One elder's pouch might contain a cedar spindle, a softwood hearthboard, and a tinder nest made from shredded cedar bark and moss, dried over smoke for days. Striking a coal from the friction of hand drill or bow drill was no casual affair. It required muscle memory, patience, and breath timed to the rhythm of rain. When the ember finally glowed, faint and smouldering, the people would lean in, protect it with cupped hands, whispering it to life like a newborn. Flame meant more than heat, it meant continuation. Around that flame, they built their homes. The longhouse was an architectural marvel of bush engineering, spanning up to 100 feet in length, rainproof, wind-resistant, warm in winter, cool in summer, and all of it without nails. Instead, they used carved cedar pegs, wooden wedges, and lashings of twisted bark cordage. The planks, split from cedar with stone mauls and antler wedges, were steamed and bent into shape. Even the supports for the roof beams were precisely jointed by hand, fitted like puzzle pieces designed for permanence. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and dried fish. Fire pits glowed down the center aisle. Sleeping platforms lined the walls. Families gathered in circles, passing down tools, songs, and stories with the same care as they passed down blades. Iron was unknown before contact, but edge tools were not. The Seclallam had their own craftsmanship. Adzes of elk antler and beaver tooth, sharpened and hafted to curved handles carved from yew or alder. These were used to shape canoes from single cedar trunks, some as long as 60 feet. The canoe was more than a vehicle. It was a lifeline. Hollowed by fire, then smoothed by adze, canoes were steamed open with hot rocks and seawater poured into their bellies. Planks and braces were added inside to preserve their shape. Each vessel was borne with ceremony, its prow often carved with thunderbirds or wolves, symbols of power and guardianship. They were built for the sea, sleek, fast, able to cut through the chop of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, or haul 1,000 pounds of salmon home from the banks of the Elwha River. Fishing, too, required tools honed by generations of survival. Bone-pointed spears, basket traps woven from willow, nets twined from stinging nettle fibre, spun on the thigh and knotted by firelight. Along the riverbanks, men stood waist-deep in icy current, reading the swirl of the water like a language. Timing was everything. The salmon came in cycles, silver, red, gold, each with its season, each with its prayer. Before the first catch of the season, an offering was made. A fish returned to the river, uncut, unspoiled. The message was clear: take what you need, honor what you take. And when the fish were cleaned, they used tools with care. Knives made from mussel shell, sharpened obsidian, and later trade steel. Drying racks were built high and long, the smoke from alder fires curling up through rows of split salmon hung on cedar poles. Salt and smoke preserved life, turning perishables into winter stores. The women, too, were makers of survival. They wove baskets that could hold water, tight as pottery, flexible as sinew. Cedar bark, softened through boiling and pounding, was twisted into cordage for snares and nets, or woven into mats for floors and walls. Clothing was stitched from deer hide and fur, sealed with pine pitch to resist the rain. Even their snowshoes, flat frames laced with rawhide, allowed them to pass over snowdrifts where others would sink. In storm and season, they endured. When European iron arrived, first through trade, then through colonization, it changed the rhythm, but not the purpose. Iron adzes, chisels, and knives were prized, but the skill of use remained the same. A moment tool is only as powerful as the hand that guides it, and the Seclallam hands were steady. They carved totem poles not just as decoration, but as testimony. Every figure, every line told a story of lineage, of lore, of lessons earned through fire and winter. But not all tools were of wood and stone. Knowledge was its own blade, sharpened by time, handed down not in books, but in demonstration. A child would learn not by lecture, but by watching, by mimicking, by repeating motions hundreds of times until they understood not just how, but why. Elders say, you don't learn to build a fire by reading about it. You learn it with wet fingers, cold breath, and the hunger of a long night. The Seclallam understood that every tool came with risk. A canoe can crack, a fire can spread, a blade can slip. Survival was not just about technique, it was about judgment, timing, respect. Today, those same skills remain. In cultural programs and wilderness classes, youth still learn to twist nettle fiber, split cedar, and strike fire with flint. Elders guide them patiently, showing how to bend wood with steam, how to shape paddles with muscle and vision. It is not nostalgia, it is continuity, because the forest still gives, the tide still teaches. and the smoke that rises from a cedar fire still carries stories of those who came before. The Sklallam didn't survive because of luck. They survived because of knowledge, because they listened to the land, and because they never stopped learning from it. And in every tool, be it antler, iron, or intention, there is a memory carved deep, of storms weathered, of hands calloused, of a people who built not just to survive, but to endure. The rain comes soft at first, just mist, curling through the trees like smoke that forgot where it came from, then heavier, until the cedar leaves drip with a rhythm older than language. Beneath that hush, the forest exhales, and the ground beneath your boots becomes something more than soil. It becomes memory. Here, on the ancestral lands of the Jamestown Sklallam, every ridge, every hollow, every overgrown trail carries the imprint of those who came before, not just as footprints, but as prayers, as stories, as blood. The Sklallam say the land remembers, even when treaties try to forget, even when roads carve through silence, even when the world moves forward with machines and maps that do not mark the sacred. And so, a new generation has taken up the task, not just to survive, not just to preserve, but to remember. They are archaeologists and land stewards, historians with cedar hearts and drone cameras, youth who walk the beach at low tide not for shells, but for signs, for midden piles, for fire-cracked stones, for the circle of stones that once held a longhouse upright through 100 winters. One such trail begins near Blyn, at the edge of Sequim Bay. It winds inland through a forest thick with salal and huckleberry, past moss-slicked stumps and roots that twist like ancient veins. For decades, this trail was believed to be logging road runoff. But when tribal archaeologist Emma James hiked it with LiDAR scans in hand, she noticed something different. The angle of the slope, the straightness of the rise. And then she found it. A ring of stones, half buried under vine maple, precisely 12 feet in diameter. She knelt, fingertips brushing the moss. A hearth. Charcoal samples later dated it to over 300 years ago, before Lewis and Clark, before borders, before conquest. A summer camp circle, likely used for berry gathering, fishing, storytelling. The land had waited for someone to ask. In another part of the forest, fire tells its own story. Black lines in the soil, thin layers of charcoal running between centuries of growth. Not wildfire, not destruction, ceremony. The Sklallam practiced controlled burns long before science gave it a name. Fire was not feared, it was invited. It cleared brush for camas fields, nourished new berry shoots, drove out disease from the forest floor. The smoke rising was a signal. This place lives. This place is cared for. Today, that tradition returns. With fire permits in hand and elders at their side, the tribe now conducts cultural burns. Slow, deliberate, respectful. The flame is small. The meaning is enormous, because fire is more than heat. It is memory in motion. From the air, drones sweep across coastline, capturing images that human eyes cannot. Tidal flats reveal grid-like structures made of stone, fish traps older than the founding of the United States. These V-shaped alignments once funneled salmon into narrow channels where they could be harvested in sustainable numbers. Ingenious, invisible at high tide, preserved by sand and silence, and now mapped by technology, protected by law. In the forests, archaeologists uncover camas ovens, stone-lined pits used to slow-bake the starchy bulbs for days, a process requiring precision, patience, and communal effort. The scent of camas baking is said to be sweet, nutty, almost like roasting chestnuts. But that scent hasn't been common here in generations. Now it returns. The Jamestown Sklallam are not just restoring the ovens, they're restoring the plant. Fields once overtaken by pasture grass are being cleared, reseeded with camas. School children come to help dig, to learn, to taste, because this too is archaeology. Not dusting off what's dead, but breathing into what still lives. not all findings are easy. In 2006, a construction project near Port Angeles unearthed human remains. At first, officials moved to reroute or remove, but the tribe intervened. These were not remains, they were ancestors. Bones laid with care, carved tools buried beside them, ochre stains on stone, signs of ceremony. The tribe halted the project, launched an excavation, and held a reburial with full honors. For the S'Klallam, the dead do not belong to history. They belong to place, and place is everything. Place is the shoreline where grandmothers gathered clams with baskets woven tight enough to hold water. Place is the forest clearing where cedar logs once echoed with adze strikes. Place is the bend in the river where stories were told in the language of firelight and salmon bones. To forget place is to forget self. And so, the Jamestown S'Klallam map the land not in coordinates, but in meaning. A boulder is not a rock. It's a grandmother turned to stone, watching. A stream is not just water. It's a path where the salmon return, and with them, the ancestors. Even the stars have memory. In a remote corner of tribal land, atop a ridge cleared of light pollution, a skywatching program has begun, reviving constellations named long before Orion or Cassiopeia. Stories of sky beings, of celestial salmon, of the moon as a canoe tipped sideways. The children lie on their backs in the grass, guided by elders, listening, learning the map above as well as the one below. This is not nostalgia. It is navigation. Because to walk these trails is not to retrace steps. It is to re-enter a conversation the land has been waiting to finish. And so, as cedar saplings are planted where clear-cuts once scarred, as oyster beds are restored along mudflats, as old growth groves are surveyed not for harvest, but for story, something ancient stirs, not revival, return. The land has always remembered. It only needed someone to listen. And now, the S'Klallam walk with both old eyes and new tools, with GPS in one hand and a memory bundle in the other. And the trails, long overgrown, begin to open once more. The road into Jamestown curves along the mist-soaked edge of the Olympic Peninsula, where the wind still carries the salt of old battles and older prayers. But now, where once only cedar trees stood and tides whispered in S'Klallam, there are buildings, modern, intentional, and sovereign. This is not a museum. This is not a replica. This is a nation, a living nation. In the 21st century, the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe stands not as a footnote in colonial history, but as an author of its own future. It begins with a constitution. Ratified in 1975, the Jamestown S'Klallam tribal constitution is more than paper. It is the codified breath of resistance. It outlines a system of governance rooted in tradition, yet designed for complexity, balancing elected councils with the voices of elders, modern law with ancient values. Where other governments once sought to erase them, the S'Klallam wrote themselves back into existence with their own ink, on their own terms. And from governance flows stewardship. Take the Dungeness River, a thread of fresh water once choked by silt, pollution, and mismanagement. Today, thanks to tribal oversight and years of restoration work, salmon once again swim its currents. Tribal scientists monitor water temperature, sediment levels, and fish migration with GPS, sonar, and drones. But behind the tech is something older, a memory of the river as it was, passed down in stories and silence. Environmental sovereignty is not a slogan here. It is a daily act of survival. On the tidelands, rows of oyster beds stretch beneath grey skies. These are not remnants, they are part of Jamestown Seafood, a tribally owned aquaculture enterprise. The oysters are cultivated with scientific precision and traditional care. They filter the water, they feed the people, they anchor the economy, not just in dollars, but in belonging. It's a reclamation not of profit, but of purpose. In a nearby facility, artisans carve cedar masks, bead regalia, and prepare cultural exhibits. Not for tourists, though visitors are welcomed with warmth, but for continuity, for the children, because cultural survival now requires education systems that teach math, yes, but also language, land, and legacy. And so, the Jamestown Seclallam have built their own educational programs, language revitalization classes, youth workshops, and tribal history woven into daily curriculum. Here, a student may learn algebra in the morning, then paddle a canoe in the afternoon, guided by elders who remember when those same waters were forbidden. Self-governance also means sovereignty in healthcare. In 2002, the tribe opened the Jamestown Family Health Clinic. What began as a small medical office has since grown into a model for native-run health systems across the country. It offers primary care, dental services, mental health counseling, and substance abuse treatment, not just for tribal members, but for the broader rural community. Healing here is holistic. It respects trauma. It listens longer. It understands that wellness is not just the absence of disease, but the presence of dignity. When the COVID-19 pandemic arrived, the Jamestown Seclallam didn't wait. They organized vaccine drives. They translated public health data into community understanding. They made decisions fast, and they made them their own. Sovereignty, in crisis, becomes clarity. And then, there is the story most people outside the tribe expect to hear: the casino. Yes, there is one. But that is not the story. The story is what that revenue built. Not luxury, not excess, but infrastructure, clinics, schools, restoration projects, housing for elders. The story is in the tribal court system that mediates justice with cultural sensitivity. The story is in the legal team that defends fishing rights still under threat. The story is in the policy work that helps shape state and federal legislation on land, water, and heritage. Because sovereignty in the 21st century is not just about holding land. It is about holding space at decision-making tables, in courtrooms, in board meetings, in classrooms. It's about speaking with authority, not asking for permission. And it is about leadership, intergenerational leadership, where wisdom does not age out, but grows louder. Tribal Chair and CEO W. Ron Allen has served his people for over 4 decades. Under his guidance, the tribe has achieved milestones that were once considered impossible. But Ron will be the first to tell you, the future does not belong to him. It belongs to the youth. And they are ready. They sit in planning meetings. They draft policy. They learn the language not just of their ancestors, but of grants, zoning codes, and legal defense. They speak in both ceremony and spreadsheet, because that is the world now, and they are fluent in both. For the Jamestown Seclallam, sovereignty is not static. It is not a flag on a pole or a title on a map. It is alive. It adapts. It defends. It grows. It's in the canoe launches that begin with prayer and end with GPS coordinates. It's in the salmon hatcheries that track genetics as carefully as the stars. It's in the tribal library where youth check out books about biology and beadwork in the same visit. This is what survivance looks like, the merging of resilience and renaissance. It looks like elders who remember boarding schools, now teaching Seclallam language to preschoolers. It looks like land once logged, now stewarded by tribal foresters with satellite imaging and cedar law. It looks like policy meetings where treaty rights are not begged for, but asserted, enforced, and expanded. There is no single image that defines the Jamestown Seclallam in this century, no symbol that can contain the fullness of their motion. But if there was, perhaps it would be this: a canoe. Not old, but freshly carved, painted in red and black, its hull smooth and gleaming with oil. It rests on a shoreline not far from where Chief James Bausch once stood, surveying a future few could imagine. The paddlers are young and old, men and women, fluent in iPhones and root songs. They push off at dawn, moving out into the salt, into the wind, into history, not as survivors of it, but as its authors. The fog returns like a familiar memory. silent, silver, and thick as a held breath. It rolls over Sequim Bay before dawn, softening every edge. The trees blur, the shoreline vanishes, and all that remains is movement, slow and sure, the sound of cedar slicing water. A canoe, painted in the red and black designs of old, pushes through the mist. Its paddlers do not speak, but their silence is not empty. It is a language all its own, older than English, older than treaties, older even than the word sklallam. It speaks of presence, of memory, of return. From the very beginning, the Jamestown sklallam were told to disappear, told that their land was no longer theirs, told that their language was broken, told that their culture was incompatible with modernity. Yet here they are, not a vanished people, but a persistent one, still fishing, still carving, still speaking, still singing, still here. And so this story, like the tide, comes full circle, not in pages or policies, but in voices. Listen, a grandmother stands beside the longhouse, hands dusted with the powdery white of smoked clamshell. Her hair is silver, her back curved, but her voice holds steady. They thought we'd forget, she says. They thought if they burned the longhouses, took our children, scattered us like ash, that the wind would carry us away. But the wind brought us back. In a small classroom, cedar shavings scatter across a table. A boy, 10, maybe 11, runs his fingers down a canoe model, tracing the grain. His teacher, a carver with hands hardened from years of shaping living wood, guides his grip on the crooked knife. "This is how you tell a tree thank you," the teacher whispers. In that single moment, steel meeting cedar, child meeting craft, there is something that feels like survival, but deeper, like remembering. In another part of the territory, a woman drapes regalia across a wooden rack. Red fringe, abalone buttons, elk hide. She's preparing for a dance, not for show, but for healing. She runs her hands across each seam, each stitch sewn with stories. "My regalia is not a costume," she says. "It's my armor. It's my grandmother's prayer and my daughter's inheritance. Every step I dance, I return something they tried to take." Then there's the fisherman, pulling his net from the river with arms that ache from generations of labor. The salmon gleams, not just as food, but as relative, as medicine. "We don't fish for the market," he says, pausing to unhook a flashing silver coho. "We fish for our story, for the day the salmon stops running is the day we stop breathing." That day has not come, and it will not, because here, history does not rest in textbooks. It moves, it adapts, it feeds, it sings. There are youth composing hip-hop verses in Siklallam, weaving rhymes around cedar bark metaphors and treaty law. There are elders teaching toddlers to say thank you in a language once banned in schools. There are scientists building climate data models with traditional ecological knowledge encoded in their DNA. This is not nostalgia. This is forward motion. The Jamestown sklallam do not live in the past. They live beside it, walk with it, feed it, bury it with respect, and resurrect it when the time is right. Every canoe launched today glides in the wake of ancestors who carved without saws, who paddled by starlight, who knew the taste of the wind and the pulse of the sea by heart. Every classroom rebuilt stands where a boarding school once silenced voices. Every restored wetland, every salmon counted, every drumbeat is proof. Proof that survival is not only endurance, it is adaptation. It is a fierce remembering. It is sovereignty lived, not claimed. Even the cedar trees remember. Cut, burned, felled, and still they rise. The young saplings grow in soil seeded with songs. Their roots dig deep, their needles gather fog, and the people who walk among them carry stories not as burden, but as compass, because this land does not forget, and neither do its people. In the final light of day, the fog begins to lift. The canoe returns to shore, its hull trailing a ripple that fades too slowly to see. From a distance, it might look like a simple act. Paddlers unloading, elders watching from the shoreline, children laughing barefoot on pebbled beaches. But look closer. That canoe was once a tree, blessed before it fell, hollowed by hand. Those paddlers trained for weeks, sinking their strokes to the beat of the paddle song. That shoreline, stolen once, reclaimed forever. And those children? They are not the end of a story. They are its continuation. They will not grow up wondering if they belong. They will grow up knowing the names of the rivers, the cadence of the drum, the smell of cedar smoke at sunrise, the meaning of sovereignty whispered by ancestors in the rustle of leaves and the hush of tides. This documentary began in fog. Now it ends in clarity. The Jamestown Seclallam are not relics, not ruins, not remnants. They are a nation, a people, a flame that endured wind after wind and still burns. They are, and always have been, still here.